Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker, a time of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We quote re-diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry Hollywood sold you. The truth, you probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just been born in the year 1340, but not as a king, not a knight, not even a stable boy. No, you're a girl. And before you've even opened your eyes, before you've taken your first breath, the world around you has already decided what kind of life you will live. Your birth is not celebrated. Your father was hoping for a son, strong, useful, inheriting his name. Instead, he sighs quietly, hands behind his back, and leaves the room. There are no fireworks, no great feast, just a flickering candle and a midwife wrapping your tiny body in scratchy wool. You're already a disappointment. Not for anything you've done, but for what you'll never be allowed to do. This is the Middle Ages. And for women, life does not begin with hope, it begins with limitation. You don't get a name right away, not officially, because no one's sure if you'll live past the week. The water is dirty. The midwife's hands were never washed. You're wrapped in rags that belong to 3 siblings who didn't survive. Your mother, exhausted and pale, doesn't smile. She's already lost 2 before you. She hopes quietly you'll be different, but hope is dangerous for women like her. As an infant, you're kept warm by the hearth, not for comfort, but for survival. There's no doctor, no cradle, no lullabies, only a smoky room, a few scraps of old cloth, and your mother humming quietly so no one hears her cry. If you do survive, your first years will pass in the shadows of your brothers. They'll learn to walk and are praised. You'll learn to pour water and are expected. They'll climb and fall. You'll clean and fold. Your father still doesn't speak to you. Not really, and why should he? You can't carry on the family name. You can't inherit land. You can't defend the home in war. In fact, one day you'll leave it entirely, traded through marriage like a sheep at market. But that's later. For now, you're just a small pair of hands. And every day, the world around you teaches you one lesson. Be quiet, be useful, be invisible. By the time you can walk, you're already carrying things. A bucket half your size, a sibling on your hip, a pile of kindling that leaves splinters in your palms. You don't get toys. You get tasks, and if you forget them, there is no forgiveness. A slap, a scold, or a night without supper. This is how you learn to remember. Your days are not your own. At 4 years old, you wake before the sun. You help stir the pottage, watery and tasteless. You fetch firewood. You sweep the floor, though the dirt comes back every time someone walks in. You listen for the creak of your father's boots. That's when everything must be spotless. You avoid his gaze. You keep your hands busy. You stay quiet. You're not taught letters. You're taught silence, because girls who speak out draw shame. Girls who play too freely tempt fate. Girls who ask questions are troublemakers. So you don't. You lower your eyes. You repeat prayers you don't understand. You copy the older women. Their bent backs, their bitten lips, their tired hands. Your body is still small, but already the world has given it a shape. Serve, obey, endure. There are no choices, only chores. No dreams, only duties. And if you're lucky, if nothing takes you in the night, you grow into a girlhood made of repetition. You don't notice when childhood ends. There's no celebration. No rite of passage, just a stain on your tunic one morning, and suddenly you are no longer a child. You are something else, something watched. Your mother pulls you aside. She doesn't smile. She whispers fast and low about modesty, secrecy, and danger. You're handed a coarse linen cloth. No instructions, just expectations. You must hide it, clean it, endure it. The church says you are now impure, once a month, a reminder of Eve's original sin. No one tells you what's happening inside your own body, only that you must be careful now, because the worst thing a girl can be is noticed. You stop climbing trees. You avoid boys, not because you want to, but because it's safer. You cover your hair. You walk slower. You fold your hands and learn to pray longer. When men visit the house, you leave the room. You hear them talk of dowries, of alliances, of marrying young. You don't speak because the future is already being spoken for. Your name whispered in someone else's business deal. Your body, the subject of someone else's price tag. You're not even 14, but your path is already narrowing like a dark hallway. And still, you keep going, because that's what the women around you do. They don't cry in public, they don't ask for kindness, they just carry on, quietly. There's no mirror in your home. You've never seen your face properly, only reflections in the water barrel, rippled, incomplete. But you've learned what beauty means by how others are treated. The prettier girls are watched more, the plainer ones are scolded less. You start to shrink, in posture, in spirit, in voice. Being overlooked feels safer than being chosen, and safety in this world is the closest thing to freedom. Your mother watches you more closely now. She speaks in warnings, not warmth. Don't laugh too loud. Don't eat too much. Don't talk when men are present. At night, you hear her cry softly while she kneads the dough. You pretend not to notice because you've learned that noticing is dangerous too. There's a wordless language between women, a glance, a tightened jaw, a sigh. And though no one ever says it aloud, you start to understand this world is not made for you. It is made around you, built to contain you and your worth. It lies not in who you are, but in what you can give. Your labor, your body, your silence. But even so, even with all that taken from you, there's a stubbornness that stays, somewhere deep, not loud, not rebellious, just rooted. You don't have much, but you hold on to that. By the time you reach your 14th year, you are no longer addressed as a child, you are spoken of in practical terms. She's of age, her hands are capable, she'll make a quiet wife, and with that, girlhood ends. No farewell, no threshold, just the gradual erasure of everything soft about you. Your hands have hardened, your back aches. You've learned to calculate how much pottage can be made with only turnips and old bread. You still wake early, still sleep last. Your life is measured in seasons, not dreams, and soon, very soon, there will be talk of another household, a man you've never met, a family you don't belong to, a future that does not ask for your opinion, only your obedience. There are no questions, only arrangements. You won't walk down an aisle in a white dress. You'll be handed over in a woolen smock, with a sheep or two as your dowry. Your father will shake hands. Your mother will cry, but not where anyone can see. And you will carry your small bundle of things, a comb, a threadbare shift, maybe a wooden spoon, and start again in someone else's home. Because that's what girls do. They disappear from one household and reappear in another, unwritten, uncelebrated, unchosen. And the saddest part, this is the best case scenario, because if you survive, you are lucky. And luck for a medieval girl is the closest thing to a miracle. So here you are, 14 years old, already a veteran of labor, already a student of silence. You've learned to suppress hunger, fear, and even hope. Your voice is soft, not because it suits you, but because it was shaped that way, for safety. You don't remember your favorite color. You don't know if you like the taste of apples. You haven't seen a map. You've never left your village, and yet you know how to mend a sleeve in the dark. You can nurse a child, stir a fire, and tell when the bread is done just by scent. You are invisible to history, but not to the dirt beneath your nails, not to the cracked skin of your feet, not to the ache in your back that began before your second decade. Your name may never be recorded, but your story is written into every task, every whispered lullaby, every silent prayer that carried you through the day. This is how it begins, not with a dream, but with a duty, not with freedom, but with the hope that maybe, just maybe, survival will be enough. And if that sounds like a hard beginning, it was. So when people speak of the simplicity of medieval life, remember this. There was no simplicity in surviving as a girl. Every breath was borrowed, every step was watched, every day a test you didn't know you were taking. And though your name is lost to time, the shape of your struggle remains, etched in stone ovens and wooden spoons, in worn floors and forgotten songs, in quiet strength passed from mother to daughter like a secret. You may not be remembered, but you were real, and that, in the end, is where our story begins. With a girl, not yet a woman, already forgotten, but still here, in memory, in echo, in truth. Now let the candle flicker lower, let the night grow softer, and let us turn the page to what came next. The sun has not risen yet, but you're already awake. The rooster crows, distant and muffled. The cold has crept into your bones overnight. There's no fire yet, no warmth waiting for you, just the hard press of a straw mat beneath your shoulder blades, and the sharp smell of unwashed wool. You sit up quietly. The room is dark. One room, for everyone. Your parents, your brothers, and you curled in a corner beside the fire pit that hasn't been lit since yesterday evening. There's no such thing as privacy here. No doors to close, no space that belongs to you. Only tasks. Always. The tasks. At 6 years old, your day begins with your bare feet touching a dirt floor. You stretch just enough to feel the chill inside your bones, and then rise, silently. You know better than to speak this early. Instead, you grab a clay jug and head outside, careful not to wake your younger siblings. The well is far. You walk with the jug swinging in your small arms, arms that are already strong from carrying more than your weight in firewood and water. You don't think of this as work. This is simply life. You reach the well with fingers stiff from the cold. The sun is barely brushing the horizon. There are other girls there too. Some older, some smaller. None of you speak much. You nod, you wait, and when it's your turn, you lower the bucket and haul it back with careful arms. It spills a little. It always does. But you've learned how to keep enough, because if you spill too much, you'll be sent back. Once the jug is full, you carry it back against your hip, trying not to slip on the uneven path. Back home, the hearth is being stirred. You help start the fire, blowing carefully into the coals, feeding it dry bits of straw, and shielding your eyes from the smoke. It catches. You don't smile, but there's a flicker of quiet pride. Then the day truly begins. You sweep the floor, though it's never truly clean. You help stir the morning mash, a thin, tasteless mix of oats and water. You help dress the smaller children, tugging scratchy linen over wriggling limbs. Your hands are always doing something, holding, scrubbing, lifting, wiping. And when they're not moving, you feel like you've done something wrong. By mid-morning, the men have gone. Your father and brothers head to the fields, while you stay behind with the women. There's an invisible line in this household, not drawn in chalk or carved in wood, but traced in every expectation placed upon you. The boys learn to wield tools. You learn to wield silence. You watch your mother grind grain, a slow, brutal rhythm. Her arms are strong, her face unreadable. You copy her movements. Slowly, quietly, you help sort dried herbs, tie bundles of leeks, skin onions, until your fingers sting. You feed the goats, clean the coop, and carry heavy pails of grey water out to the side of the house. The smell never leaves you. You get used to it. You stop noticing the chickens underfoot, the fleas in the blanket, the rough scrape of bark against your palms. But you don't stop noticing how tired your mother looks, or how she presses her temple when she thinks no one sees. There is no word for stress, no word for burnout, only the dull ache of repetition. The days blend together, each one demanding something from your small frame and giving nothing back in return. Seasons change, but the labor does not. In summer, the air is thick with flies. In winter, your breath clouds the air indoors. The chores shift slightly with the weather, fetching snow instead of water, drying herbs in the rafters instead of the sun. But the rhythm stays the same, so does the silence. Discipline comes quickly in this world. A spilled bowl, a broken dish, a missed step. Nothing is minor when every scrap of food, every inch of fabric, every piece of wood is precious. You are not beaten every day, but the fear of it hums quietly in the walls. A raised voice is enough to still your spine. A heavy footstep can make your stomach clench. You learn to move like smoke, light, careful, unnoticed. Your emotions become a private garden. You don't cry unless you're alone. And when you laugh, which is rare, you cover your mouth, almost in apology. You begin to forget what your favorite sound is. But you know what quiet feels like. You live inside it. Some days you forget how small you are, until you lift a bucket too heavy, and your back twists wrong, or you burn your fingers on the cooking pot, and must keep working anyway. There is no sick day, no rest day, just work. Other girls live nearby. Sometimes you see them when you go to the well, or help at market. You don't play. Not really. There's no time for it, but you glance. You observe how one girl's braid is tighter, how another's dress has been mended less often. You wonder if their homes are like yours. Do their fathers shout? Do their mothers sigh the same way? Do they wake up cold? These questions stay inside, because you've also learned asking is a kind of risk. So you learn from silence, from body language, from the way women move when they are watched and when they are not. You begin to imitate them, how they carry weight on one hip, how they nod without speaking, how they keep their gaze low when men pass by. Your identity is shaped, not in self-discovery, but in careful mimicry. You are not taught to find yourself. You are taught to fit in, exactly, precisely, because a girl who stands out invites scrutiny, and scrutiny leads to danger. So you adjust until even your breath feels borrowed. You help prepare every meal, but you're the last to eat. That's how it works. The men eat first, your father, your older brothers, then the smaller children, then your mother, and then you. Whatever is left. If anything, you take it with gratitude, even if it's crusts, even if it's cold. You've learned that asking for more is impolite, ungrateful, even shameful. So you eat in silence, and you clean up in silence. You scrape the bowls, gather the spoons, wipe the rough wooden table until your fingers sting from the grain. No one thanks you, and you don't expect it, because that's how the world has shaped your expectations, not around fairness, but around survival. You go to bed still hungry some nights, but never without finishing your chores. You lie down beside your siblings, the same rough blanket shared among too many bodies, and sometimes, in that liminal space between sleep and waking, you wonder, is there a world beyond this? You've never seen a book, never held a quill, never heard your own name spoken in admiration, just commands, and silence, always silence. Once or twice a year, there is music, not from instruments, not always, sometimes just the sound of clapping, singing and wooden shoes, tapping in dirt. Festival days, they come with extra bread, a little honey if you're lucky, and hours where the chores slow down. You see women laugh, really laugh. You see men dance, awkwardly but freely. Children run, barefoot and wild. And for a few precious hours, you almost forget the weight you carry. Almost. You watch the firelight flicker on your mother's face, and for a moment she looks young, not happy, not exactly, but less heavy. You memorize the sound of her laugh, because you don't hear it often. You spin in a circle once, twice, and then the night ends. The fire dies, the bread is gone, and the labor returns, as steady as sunrise. But something stays with you, the memory of lightness, the brief escape, the reminder that your body can still move in joy. Even if only for a few minutes, it is not freedom, but it's close enough to keep you hoping. And sometimes, that's all you need. As the years pass, your imagination begins to dim, not all at once, but slowly, like a candle burning lower each night. You used to pretend the broom was a horse. Now it's just a broom. You used to sing to the goats. Now you only speak when necessary. You used to look at clouds and name their shapes. Now you don't have time to look up. What was once wonder becomes routine, and what was once routine becomes a kind of sleep, a waking sleep, filled with tasks and time but little else. There's no rebellion in you, no spark of resistance, because no one around you has ever spoken of such things. Even the women who are kind are resigned. Even the girls who laugh do so carefully. So you grow, not taller necessarily, but quieter, more precise, more obedient, more capable of making yourself disappear in a room full of people. By the time you reach your 10th year, you've mastered more skills than most adults today. You can bake bread from scratch, mend clothes with thread so fine it vanishes, carry water without spilling a drop. But you've never read your own name, never had a birthday cake, never been asked what you want to become, because you've already become it. A servant to survival, an apprentice to obedience, a child of silence. And though no one will write your name in a book, your story, this story, is real, etched not in ink, but in the grooves of calloused hands. And so we leave this chapter, not with a climax, but with a continuation of labor, of repetition, of life lived in the quiet corners of history. The next chapter awaits, but for now, rest. You've done more than enough. Sometimes you hear stories, whispered, half true, and shaped more by repetition than fact. Stories of nuns who read books, of queens who wear silk, of women who ride horses. They sound like fairy tales, not because they're magical, but because they're distant. You've never seen a nun, you've never touched silk, and the only horse you've seen pulled a cart until its ribs showed. Still, the stories linger. They echo in your mind while you knead dough. They drift through your thoughts while you rinse pots with cold, grey water. They curl around your dreams when sleep finally comes. A woman with her own room, a woman with a pen, a woman who chooses. You don't envy them exactly. It's more abstract than that. You simply wonder, what if? And then just as quickly, you stop wondering, because a distracted girl is a careless girl, and a careless girl is punished. So you return your thoughts to the task at hand, back straight, hands moving, face still. There's dignity in work. That's what they say, and maybe that's true. But it's hard to feel dignified when your hands are raw and your future is already decided. So you find pride in small things instead. A perfectly chopped leek, a fire that catches on the first try, a stain scrubbed clean with lye and elbow grease. These are your accomplishments. Quiet, hidden, uncelebrated. But they are yours, and in a life where so little belongs to you, even that is something. At night, before sleep, you sometimes trace the rafters above your bed with your eyes. They creak, they shift. Sometimes a spider drops silently from the edge of the beam. You count the knots in the wood, not because you want to, but because you've run out of other things to imagine. You no longer make up stories. You no longer name the stars. Even wonder has its cost. But you still breathe, you still wake, you still endure. And that endurance, quiet, unseen and unpaid, is its own kind of strength. This chapter is not about failure, nor is it about sorrow. It's about survival, in its most stripped, raw form, about hands that ache, but never stop moving, about a girl who is invisible to history, but not to herself. So sleep now, little one, not because your work is done, it never truly is, but because the night offers one small mercy, a few hours without burden, a few hours to be still, and in that stillness, something like peace. By the time you reach your 10th year, you are no longer simply a child, you're not yet a woman. But the world begins to treat you as if you're preparing to become one. There is no ceremony for this transition, no birthday candle, no sudden shift in title, just subtle changes. You are handed more responsibility, fewer breaks, stricter expectations. You are asked to carry more, not just in weight, but in silence. Your body is watched now, not with care, but with calculation. Your mother begins to speak to you differently, not unkindly, but with less softness, more instructions, fewer stories. She corrects the way you sit, the way you carry yourself, the way you respond to a man's question. Even if the man is your uncle, you don't fully understand why yet, but you feel it, the gaze of the village settling on your frame, like a garment too big, too heavy, and entirely unwanted. At first, the rules are subtle. No more running barefoot outside, no more shouting across the yard, no more roughhousing with your brothers. You're not told why, only that it's time to act like a young lady. That phrase means something different here. It doesn't mean dignity or pride. It means shrinking, tucking in your elbows, folding your laughter, closing off the parts of you that once moved freely. You're taught how to keep your gaze lowered when spoken to, how to say yes, even when your chest is full of no, how to apologize for things you don't understand. There are no books, no schools. Your education comes from watching, repeating, enduring. You watch your mother prepare meals in silence, even when she's in pain. You watch her scrub the same cloth 5 times to remove a stain. You watch how she speaks to men with practiced calm, even when they're wrong. And you are expected to learn, not through words, but through imitation. Your hands no longer belong to you. They are for bread, for weaving, for cleaning. Your thoughts no longer roam. They are for remembering things, what he likes, how he likes it, and what happens if you forget. Then, your body begins to change. Slowly, then all at once. Your chest begins to ache, unfamiliar and sore. You notice the way fabric clings differently. You notice how people notice. It is not welcome. Your mother gives you cloth, rough linen, folded awkwardly, and tells you what to do when the bleeding starts. There is no celebration, no comfort, just instructions. Wrap, wash, hide. You are not to speak of it, except to her, and even then, sparingly. You do not ask questions, because there are no answers, only consequences. If someone finds the cloth, if someone sees the stain, if someone suspects, you are no longer innocent, even if you've done nothing. Because in this world, a girl's body becomes dangerous the moment it becomes visible. And so, you hide it under layers of wool, behind eyes that stop making contact, beneath hands that never stop moving, for fear that stillness might attract attention. You learn to stay quiet in rooms with men, to lower your voice around strangers, to never be alone outdoors. Once the sun starts to fall, and perhaps worst of all, you begin to understand why. Not because someone explained it, but because you've seen what happens to girls who don't. One evening, you overhear your name. It drifts from behind a half-closed door. Your father, your uncle, a neighbor. They're not talking about you like a child. They're talking about you like a transaction. There's mention of land, of cattle, of a strong back, and obedient temperament. It takes you a moment to realize they mean you. Your worth is being measured, not in dreams or talents, but in what you bring to another man's household. A dowry, maybe a goat, maybe a small corner of your family's land, maybe just the promise of hands that never say no. You are not invited into the room, but your future is being drawn inside it. The man they speak of, he's older. You've seen him once at the market. He did not look at you like a person. He looked at you like something owed. Your mother doesn't speak of it directly, but she starts to prepare you differently. More lessons in bread making, in spinning flax without knots, in how to carry yourself with dignity, which means never disagreeing, never speaking unless asked, and never appearing tired, even when you are. You don't cry, you just go still inside, like a deer in snow, listening for danger that's already arrived. You start to forget the sound of your own laugh. Not because it disappears all at once, but because it is no longer invited. You laugh less at meals, not because there's nothing funny, but because you are watched, and laughter draws eyes. You smile less, even at your younger siblings, because joy begins to feel like something foreign, like a thing you once borrowed, but had to return. Instead, you perfect your stillness, how to sit for hours with straight posture and downcast eyes, how to say yes without smiling, how to move like you belong to someone else, because soon you will. The whispers grow louder. Talk of when, not if, the match will be finalized. Talk of your value while you're still young. Talk of how lucky you'll be, because he is respectable, but you do not feel lucky. You feel misplaced, like your body and your mind are drifting apart. Your thoughts want to run out the door, into the woods, toward anything unknown. But your hands stay busy, your face stays calm. This is how girls disappear. Not suddenly, not violently, but quietly, through practiced obedience. Through 1,000 little lessons that teach you to nod, serve, smile, and vanish. And you are a fast learner. At church, the lessons change too. You begin to hear more about obedience, about the virtue of a quiet wife, about the holiness of suffering. The priest does not speak to you directly, but he speaks in a voice loud enough for girls to hear. He says the Virgin Mary was pure because she obeyed, that Eve brought ruin because she questioned. You sit beside your mother, your fingers locked in your lap, and you wonder how many women believed this before you. You don't understand every word, but you understand the message. A good girl listens. A good girl waits. A good girl does not want. Desire is dangerous. Opinion is pride. Doubt is sin. So you tuck your questions beneath your breath. You fold your thoughts like laundry, stacked, silent, hidden away. Even prayer becomes a kind of apology. Forgive me for feeling. Forgive me for wondering. Forgive me for wishing I was free. You're not angry, not yet, just tired. And so, when the sermon ends, you walk home slower than before. Not to enjoy the air, but because each step feels heavier than the last. As the seasons shift, so does the tone of your home. There's more talk of your departure, not if, but when. Your mother begins setting things aside. A second-hand wool dress, mended so finely the patches almost vanish. A wooden spoon carved smooth with use. A handkerchief embroidered with your initials, though you've never held a needle. You're being prepared, not with affection, but with efficiency. Every task is now a lesson. Every failure, a warning. This won't be tolerated in your husband's house, she says. When you burn the bread, don't sulk. A wife doesn't sulk, she says. When you grow quiet after scolding, your bed feels different now. Not because the straw is thinner, but because it no longer feels like yours. Nothing does. You've become a guest in your own childhood, a visitor waiting to be sent elsewhere. No one asks if you're ready. No one asks what you want, because it doesn't matter. Your path was drawn before you were born, and now your feet must follow it. The day before you leave, your younger sister braids your hair. Her hands are clumsy. Her eyes are full. She asks if it hurts. You say no, but it does, not the braid. The leaving. That night, you lie awake, listening to the familiar creaks of the rafters. You trace the same knots you've counted since you were 5. and you wonder if anyone will remember the girl who used to laugh too loud, run too fast, and dream too much. You close your eyes and try to remember her yourself, but she's already gone. And in her place, a wife in waiting. The morning arrives not with sunlight, but with silence. You wake before the others, not from rest, but from the weight in your chest. You rise quietly, dress quietly, braid your own hair for the first time. Your mother stands by the door with a bundle. She doesn't hug you, she presses it into your arms and nods. You nod back, because tears would make it harder for both of you. The walk to your new life is short, but it feels endless. The house is larger than yours, but colder. There are windows, but they don't open. A hearth, but no warmth yet. The man who will call himself your husband doesn't speak much. He shows you your duties, points, instructs, leaves. You do not speak either. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've been trained for this. Trained to endure, to adapt, to vanish beneath the surface of routine. That night, you lie on a bed that doesn't creak. The straw is fresh. The blanket is heavier. You do not cry, because there's no time for softness here. Instead, you trace the ceiling with your eyes. No rafters, no knots. Only smooth wood, silent and unfamiliar. And you think of the girl you used to be. The one who named clouds, who laughed at goats, who danced once under firelight. You do not mourn her, you carry her in the curve of your spine, in the silence behind your eyes, in the careful way you move through this new world. Quiet, but not gone. And that is how a wife is made, not through love, not through choice, but through slow, invisible shaping, through training so deep it feels like memory, through the quiet endurance of girlhood, unseen, unnamed, but never truly erased. Later that week, you are taught how to care for the chickens, how to collect eggs without cracking them, how to break the neck of one cleanly. When it's time to eat, you don't flinch anymore, not because it's easy, but because you've learned how to silence your reaction. Your husband rarely speaks during meals. He eats first, then you. Your silence pleases him, and so it becomes your offering, your shield, your power, the only one left to you. In the evenings, you sweep the floor in circles, always clockwise. Your mother said it brings good luck. You don't believe in luck anymore. But the motion calms you. You hum quietly. Not a song, just sound. And in that low hum, in the rhythm of your hands, you find the faintest echo of the girl you were. You are not free, but you are still here. And in a world that has done all it can to mold you into absence, presence, even quiet presence, is a quiet kind of rebellion. One day, an old woman from the village stops by. She eyes you carefully, not unkindly, just with the weight of someone who remembers what it's like to be new here. She places a hand on your shoulder and says, "It gets quieter before it gets easier," and then she leaves. You don't understand it then, not completely, but weeks later, when the silence feels less like absence and more like air, you begin to. You aren't happy. But you are functional. The animals are fed, the hearth stays warm, the floor is swept. You no longer miss the girl you were. You've folded her into the routine, stitched her into the hem of your dress, braided her into your hair. She is still there. She is you. Only quieter. Only changed. And that is how a wife survives. Not by forgetting, but by carrying the memory carefully, like a candle in wind. You wake up on a Sunday. It's not so different from other days, but you can feel the stillness in the air. A quiet pause that wraps around the village like the fog that drifts in from the hills. No tools clatter, no carts rumble, no voices rise, because today is the Lord's day. You put on your cleanest dress, still stained at the hem. You pull your shawl tight over your shoulders, and you walk slowly toward the chapel at the edge of the village. It is small, stone walls, wooden doors, a narrow spire that leans just slightly to the left, as though bowing under the weight of its own certainty. Inside, the light is dim, filtered through stained glass that turns grey sunlight into muted blue and blood red. You kneel, not because you understand everything, but because everyone does, and because not kneeling is not an option. The priest begins to speak. His voice is low, measured, not warm, not cruel, just certain. He speaks of Eve, of her curiosity, of her disobedience, of the price paid by all who came after. He says that because of her sin, all women must bear pain, all women must serve, all women must obey. You glance at your mother. Her eyes are closed, her face unreadable, but you see the tension in her shoulders. You look down at your hands. Suddenly, they feel heavier. You are told that your voice is dangerous, that your thoughts must be tamed, that your body is a vessel, holy only when silent, pure only when unseen. There is no mention of joy, no room for wonder, only discipline and repentance. He says women are weaker, that they must be guided, that their hearts wander if left unchecked. You wonder if he has ever spoken to one. Confession is expected, even from girls. You sit in a darkened booth, knees pressed together, hands cold. The priest asks what you have done, what you have thought. You say, I spoke out of turn. You say, I envied my sister's new shawl. You say, I daydreamed during chores. He nods, he gives you penance, and you leave. Not lighter, but smaller, because even the smallest parts of you, your thoughts, your wants, your moments of delight, are now things to be managed, restrained, apologized for. There's a guilt that follows you, like smoke in your clothes long after the fire has died. The church teaches that this is right, that you were born in sin, that your suffering is noble, and your silence is holy. You begin to wonder if joy is a kind of sin. You stop singing while you work. You stop skipping when you carry water. You stop smiling at your reflection in the stream. It's safer that way. There are rules for how you must dress. Your sleeves must cover your wrists. Your neckline must never dip too low. Your hair, once loose and laughing in the wind, must now be pinned, braided, hidden beneath linen. It isn't just about what you wear, it's about who you might tempt, and how much blame you'll carry if you do. Even if nothing happens, the sin lies in being seen. On holy days, the rules grow stricter. You attend mass fasting. You speak only in whispers. You kneel until your legs tremble, but you do not complain, because suffering, you're told, makes you clean. You memorize the stories of saints, not the joyful ones, but the ones who were punished well, who endured starvation, silence, fire, and cold without asking why. You start to model yourself after them, not because you want to, but because you fear what happens if you don't. You learn to confess not just your actions, but your feelings, pride, envy, restlessness. Even hope, when it grows too bright, can feel dangerous under the weight of doctrine. You begin to see yourself the way they describe you, not as someone whole, but as someone broken, as someone dangerous, if left unchecked. You move with caution. You speak only when spoken to, and even then, you weigh your words before they leave your lips, because someone is always watching. If not your neighbor, then your priest. If not your priest, then your God. Judgment never sleeps, and you start to believe that the worst thing you could do is be truly seen. When your body begins to change, you stir warned more urgently. Cover your chest. Keep your gaze low. Do not walk alone, because men cannot help themselves, they say. And if something happens, they'll ask what you were wearing, so you learn to blame yourself preemptively. It's safer that way. By the time you are grown, you have become an expert in invisibility. You move through the village like smoke, present but untouchable, necessary but uncelebrated. Even when you marry, the church remains at your shoulder. It blesses the union, but it does not bless you. Your husband is told he is the head. You are the rib, his crown of strength. You, his quiet, obedient helper. If he is unkind, you are told to be more patient. If he strays, you are told to pray harder. If you complain, they ask what you did to provoke him. You learn quickly that the church offers no refuge from the weight of being a woman. Only rules, only blame, only silence. You become a mother, not when you're ready, but when you're expected to. You give birth on the dirt floor of your home. A priest standing by with holy water in case the baby does not cry. They say it's your punishment, the pain of Eve echoing through your body. But you don't scream, because saints don't scream, because women who fear God suffer quietly. You survive. The child survives. The village congratulates your husband. You are praised only if you return to chores within days. The baby is baptized. The priest reminds you this is your duty to raise them in God's image, to keep them obedient, to keep them afraid. Because fear, they say, is a form of love. You do not question it aloud, but some nights, when everyone is asleep, you look at your daughter and wonder, will she also learn to fear her thoughts, her skin, her joy? You tuck the question away. You pray harder. You repent for even asking. The seasons pass. Years blur. You go to church every Sunday. You know the verses by heart. You teach your daughters the same lessons you were taught, not because you believe all of them, but because you know the cost of not teaching them. You train them to be small, so the world won't crush them. You train them to be quiet, so the world won't shame them. You train them to kneel because standing might get them hurt, and in doing so, you pass down the legacy, not of faith, but of fear wrapped in scripture. The church doesn't need to be cruel. It only needs to be present. Its silence is enough. Its stories, enough. You live your whole life trying to be good, but in the end, you're not sure. If you were ever allowed to be whole, you grow old. The lines on your face deepen, your hands stiffen, your hair grays beneath the same linen veil you wore at 15. You still go to church, but now you sit in the back. The fire in your knees makes kneeling hard, but no one minds. You've earned your quiet. Sometimes, during long sermons, your mind wanders. You think of the girl you were, before the rules, before the shame, before you were told what you could be, and how little of that was your choice. You wonder what God thinks of you now, not the God from the pulpit, but the one you speak to in whispers when the house is dark and the wind howls. Does he see the effort behind your silence? The ache behind your obedience? You do not know, but you still pray, not for forgiveness, but for understanding, for your daughters, for your mother, for yourself, because you have followed every rule. And still, the peace they promised never came. Maybe it was never meant to. Maybe being a woman in the eyes of the church was never about finding peace, but about surviving guilt. When you die, they will dress you in white. They will call you pious. They will say you were faithful. And maybe that's true. But if anyone asks what the church made of you, the answer is simple. It made you quiet. It made you small. It made you invisible, even to yourself. And you carried that invisibility with grace, because it was all you were allowed to carry. There were women who broke the rules. Midwives, healers, widows who read scripture for themselves, girls who ask questions, too many, or too well. The church had names for them. Temptress, rebel, witch. Sometimes those women vanished. Sometimes they were shamed. Sometimes they were burned. You learn to stay away from herbs, to never read aloud, to say, I don't know when you did, because knowledge made you visible, and visibility made you dangerous. So you became careful. You whispered advice to younger women, but never in groups of more than 2. You hummed healing songs, but only while baking bread. You let your intelligence fold into silence, because silence was safer than fire. And still, late at night, you wonder about those women, the ones who spoke and paid. You wonder if they were afraid, or if for one bright second, they felt something like freedom. You hope they did. And as you lie in bed, wrinkled hands clasped, listening to the chapel bell ring far in the distance, you pray not just for your soul, but for theirs, for the women who disobeyed, for the ones who obeyed too well, for the ones who were never allowed to try. You pray for a heaven where voices are not sins, where curiosity is not a curse, where joy is not suspicious, where a woman is not an afterthought to someone else's sermon, where you finally can be whole. Years pass like pages in a book no one reads aloud. Your back curves, your voice softens. But the church still speaks with the same certainty. A younger priest has taken over now. His sermons are polished, crisp, but the message has not changed. Women must be modest, women must be obedient, women must be humble, always humble. He doesn't speak of your labor, or the sleepless nights you nursed fevers, or the cleverness it took to keep hunger from your door. He doesn't speak of your grief, of burying children, of standing at the edge of the village as plagues took husbands and sons while you kept breathing. He speaks only of your sins, the imagined ones, the ones that live in your body just because you were born a woman, and you sit in the last pew, hands folded, eyes down, wondering how much holiness has nothing to do with God and everything to do with control. You leave the church quietly, you always have, but one day you stop at the door. Just for a moment, you look at the altar, at the candles, at the crucifix above, and you say nothing, not out of submission, but because no words are needed. You walk home with your head just slightly higher, not in rebellion, not in pride, but in peace, because you've carried a faith deeper than obedience, one made of kindness and aching love, and the quiet belief that women are more than what they're told to be, even if no one says it out loud. Especially then, you are 12 years old. Your hands are still calloused from climbing trees. Your feet know the dirt paths better than your tongue knows prayers. You still dream of goats with names, and the songs your sister hums when she spins wool. But today, your mother brushes your hair for too long. She does not smile. She places a ribbon in your braid, a ribbon you've only worn on holy days, and when you ask why, she says quietly, "Guests are coming." You sit at the table with your knees tucked under your skirt, trying to shrink yourself from the gaze of the man who walks in. He is not old, but he is not young either. He has a beard flecked with ash. He speaks to your father, not to you. He never asks your name. They talk of land, of goats, of a plot near the river. Your mother doesn't speak. She watches the floor. You are not introduced. Because you are not the bride yet, just the offering. That night, you hear the words, "She is of good childbearing age. She is obedient. She is quiet." As though that is all there is to know. The next morning, your father gives you a woven bracelet. His mother's, you think it's a gift. It is not. It is a farewell. Within a week, the deal is sealed. Not with your words, but with your father Sep's handshake. You are not in the room when it happens, but you are told, gently but firmly, that you are to marry in the spring. You nod. Not because you understand, but because there is no one to ask. There is no proposal, no celebration, just a shift in how the village looks at you. Older women begin to speak to you differently. Their eyes soften, but their words sharpen. You'll learn to keep a good hearth. You'll bear strong sons. You mustn't speak back, not even kindly. The girls your age drift away. They still giggle by the stream, but now, when you walk by, they lower their voices. You are no longer one of them. You are no longer anything in between. You are betrothed. You are spoken for. You are becoming a wife. Your mother teaches you how to bake bread that will not burn, how to grind herbs for aches, and boil water for birth. She does not explain why her eyes are always red at dusk. You ask her what it feels like to be married. She says nothing. Instead, she hands you a cloth soaked in vinegar and shows you how to clean blood from linen. The morning of your wedding arrives with frost on the ground and dread in your chest. You are washed in cold water, scrubbed with salt, your hair brushed until your scalp stings. A neighbor braids rosemary into your hair. For purity, she says. You wear a dress that is not yours. It belonged to your cousin. She died last spring giving birth to twins. No one speaks of that. You are not allowed to eat, not because of ritual, but because nerves make your stomach twist like rope. Outside, guests gather with stale bread and weak wine. There is no music, just murmurs and the rustle of cloaks in the wind. The priest does not ask if you consent. He asks your father if he gives you, and your father nods. You are handed over like coin or cattle, like something that can be exchanged without breaking. You repeat the words, not because you mean them, but because they are the only words given to you. You do not look at the man beside you. You look at your hands. They are shaking. When the blessing is spoken, they say you are now one flesh. But it doesn't feel like unity. It feels like erasure. You are no longer a daughter. You are now a wife. And no one tells you what to do with the part of you that still feels like a child. After the vows, you are taken to his home. It is smaller than you imagined, darker, smelling faintly of smoke and sweat. His mother is there. She watches you like you are a bundle of kindling. Useful, if lit the right way. You try to smile. It does not reach your eyes. You are shown where the flour is kept, where the wool is stored, where the chamber pot is emptied. No one shows you where to put your sorrow. The bed is narrow. The sheets are rough. There is a cross above the doorway and silence between you and your new husband. You do not know what to say. So you say nothing. That night, he touches you. Not cruelly, not kindly either. Just as a man claiming what has been paid for. You lie still. You count the cracks in the ceiling. You whisper the names of saints in your head. In the morning, you bleed. His mother smiles. She tells the neighbors, there is bread baked in your name, not because you are loved, but because you are proven. You sit on the stool beside the hearth, feet tucked in, hands trembling. He leaves for work. You begin to sweep, and just like that, your girlhood ends. Each day is a mirror of the last. You rise before the sun, light the fire, knead the bread. You wash linens in freezing streams until your fingers crack and bleed. You speak only when spoken to. Even then, rarely more than a sentence. Just thick, like smoke that never clears. You are watched by your husband's family, by neighbors, by God, they say. Your meals are eaten standing, your rest taken in snatches, and all the while, you wait for your belly to swell. Because a wife who does not bear children is a failure, a flaw, a curse. You fear the months without blood. You fear the months with it too. You fear everything, and no one notices. When you do conceive, you whisper the news to yourself first. Not in joy, but in apology. You do not know how to be a mother when you have not yet been allowed to be a girl. The ache in your hips is constant. The weight in your heart, heavier still. Still, you smile. When women visit, when neighbors ask, when your husband lays a hand on your belly like he planted something and expects it to grow, and you pray, not for a son, not even for safety, just for time to become something other than someone sits possession. The day of birth arrives like a storm. Without warning, you scream. You cry out for your mother. She comes, but her hands are not enough to stop the pain that splits you in two. The midwife is firm, not cruel. She has done this many times. She has buried half of them. You push, you tear, you bleed, and at the end of it, a child cries. It is a boy. They say you are blessed, but you feel hollow. Your body is not yours. Your breasts ache. You bleed for weeks, and no one lets you rest. Always bread to bake, always linen to wash, more mouths to feed. Your husband tells you it is time to try again. You nod, because what else can you do? The years blur, more children come. One does not live, the others do. Your back bends, your face grows thin. You stop humming, No one notices. You are called wife, mother, blessed, but never by your name. You forget what it sounded like when someone said it with love. Seasons pass. You no longer count them. You know the harvests by the calluses on your palms, the winters by the cracks in your lips. Your children grow. One looks like your husband, another laughs like your sister once did. They are fed, they are clothed, they are alive. And that is enough, they tell you. You rarely speak unless asked. You do not ask questions. You do not dream. Dreaming is a luxury, like honey or soft wool, meant for others. Sometimes you wake in the night, with tears on your cheeks, but you don't know why. Your husband snores beside you. The fire has long gone cold. You think of running, but there is nowhere to go. No coin, no safety, no name that belongs to you alone. At church, you bow your head. Not in piety, but in habit. You mouth prayers because silence is too loud. One day, a younger girl enters the village, newly betrothed. She looks at you with wide, hopeful eyes, and you smile, a sad smile, the kind only other women understand. You want to tell her, hold on to yourself, keep a part of you hidden, safe, whole, but you do not speak, because no one warned you either. Your hair grays before your time. Your hands are stiff now, the knuckles swollen, slow to close. No one notices. You are still expected to serve, to mend, to bake, to kneel. You do these things without question, not because you are obedient, but because it is easier than resistance. Your children marry. You prepare your daughter for her own wedding. You braid rosemary into her hair. You teach her how to keep bread from burning. You do not teach her how to weep quietly, that she will learn on her own. You become smaller in the village, less visible, a shadow with kind eyes. They call you blessed matron. They ask you for recipes, for healing herbs, but not for your story. No one wants to hear how you never chose any of it. One day, you see yourself in a pan of still water, a face worn by time, creased by silence. You wonder where the girl went, the one who climbed trees and named goats, and laughed until her ribs hurt. You wonder if she still lives somewhere, under the wool and bone of the woman you became. And then you light a candle, and sweep the floor, and hum the faintest song your sister once sang. You don't remember the words, but the melody stays. You are old now, no longer useful, but no longer watched. You sit by the hearth, spinning wool with fingers that barely feel. You are alone often, but the silence no longer frightens you. You've outlived your husband. He passed without much ceremony, just a bell, a prayer, and a day of quiet. You did not cry. You had done your grieving years before. Your sons visit. They bring children who tug at your skirts and ask strange questions about the past. You answer gently, with stories that are softer than the truth. You no longer speak of the girl you were. It feels too far away, like something you dreamed. You spend your days in the sun when there is sun. You watch the clouds when there is not. You hum, you pray, you wait, and in the waiting, you make peace with the smallness of your life. You are not remembered for great deeds. No songs bear your name. No records hold your story, but your daughter braids rosemary into her own daughter's hair. And when asked why, she says, "My mother taught me, and perhaps that is enough." One evening, as the sun folds itself into the hills, you light a candle and sit alone. You think about all the days that passed quietly, like birds that flew overhead while you worked, never noticing you below. You do not feel bitter, just distant. You wonder if this is what survival means. Not triumph, not glory, but simply endurance. You lived. You stayed. You carried. You were given nothing, but you gave all. And in this giving, you became invisible. Still, in the stillness of that hour, you feel her again, the girl in the field, naming clouds, laughing at wind, unaware of the weight ahead. You whisper her name, your name. once softly, and in that whisper, you remember you were here. You mattered, even if the world forgot. You rise before the sun. Not because you are rested, but because the hearth has gone cold, and someone must bring the day back to life. The house is dark, silent except for the faint shifting of children and the muffled cough of your husband, still tangled in the hay-stuffed bedding. You do not wake him. He will rise when it suits him. Your hands reach for kindling, with a motion so practiced, you do not think about it. The flint sparks. The fire coughs into being. This is how your day begins. Not with hope, but with duty. The floor must be swept. The goats must be milked. The bread must be set to rise. There is no schedule written. The work announces itself in silence, in rot, in the cries of children. You wear the same wool dress you wore yesterday, and the day before. It carries the smell of smoke, of milk, of the child who clung to your hip while you stirred porridge with your other hand. You are not alone, but you are never quite with others either. Even when the room is full, you are busy, hands moving, mind-tracking lists. Eyes never still. They call you mother, they call you wife, but no one calls you by name before asking for something. There is no weekend, no reprieve. Your work is not seasonal. It is daily, hourly, constant. You boil water in a soot-darkened pot. You scrub linens with sand and lye. Hands roar before the sun reaches its peak. You chase hens, mend tunics, patch roofs with clay when the men are too busy or too drunk. No one thanks you. Thanks are not customary for things expected. You are not paid. You are not praised. Your value is measured in what remains unbroken. A hearth that stays warm. A child that grows. A floor free of dung and ash. And so you work, even when your back aches, even when your knees throb, even when your womb bleeds. You do not stop because there is no one else, because no one will come. Time folds in on itself. Yesterday feels like today. Tomorrow holds no promise, but more of the same. You forget the date. You forget your birthday. You only remember what must be done before dusk. The candle stubs must be trimmed. The root cellar checked. The winter cloak repaired. You are tired, but it is a quiet kind of tired. Not the kind you can sleep away, but the kind you carry like old grief stitched into your bones. Your body becomes a map of the work. Your palms thicken with calluses. Your shoulders knot from lifting, kneading, hauling water across frozen ground. Your knees remember every stone floor. Your spine stoops before your 40th year. When your children ask you what day it is, you do not know, but you know which herbs to use for colic. You know how to stretch flour with water, so it still tastes like bread. You know how to keep the chickens alive through a bitter spring, and how to mend a broken latch with twine and patience. These are your gifts. No one taught you, not directly. You learned by watching, by failing, by being scolded and corrected until it became instinct. You learned not to ask for help, because help is rarely offered, because asking makes you look weak. You teach your daughter the same things, not because you want her to carry this weight, but because no one else will prepare her. You show her how to knead without tearing the dough, how to hide tears behind lowered eyes, how to silence her own pain until it stops speaking to her. And she learns faster than you hoped, because survival teaches quicker than love. No one records what you do. There is no ledger where your hours are tallied. No ink stains the parchment with your name beside the word essential. And yet, if you stopped for a single day, everything would collapse. Meals would not appear. Children would go unwashed. The hearth would grow cold. Still, you are told your place is small, your work expected. Your name is spoken less and less. Unless something is missing, you do not cry anymore. Not because you are strong, but because crying wastes salt and silence gets more done. You measure your worth in things unseen. A baby's steady breath at midnight, a stew thick enough to satisfy, a husband who eats and says nothing. No bruises today, no shouting. A victory. You fold this into your heart, like a secret, like something delicate that would not survive the light. Your daughter grows into your shadow. She mimics your steps, your quiet gestures, your lowered gaze. One day you catch her washing a cloth. In the same circular rhythm you once learned. You want to tell her, be louder than I was, dream wider, run, if you can. But instead you say, use hotter water next time, because this world does not reward girls who speak with fire. Even among women, there is no sanctuary. The older ones watch you. Their eyes are not cruel, just worn, like yours. They correct you if your shawl slips, if your skirt rises too high as you work, not out of meanness, but because they remember the cost of appearing too free. They speak softly, but with judgment carved into every glance. They praise quiet daughters. They mock the girl who laughs too loudly, or dances without music. They were taught, as you are taught, that obedience keeps you safe. It doesn't, but it keeps you less noticed. And sometimes that is enough. You go to the village well each morning. There, the women speak in half-truths, gossip wrapped in pleasantries. You listen, you nod, you offer nothing, because trust is a luxury, like fresh fruit in winter, even in sisterhood. You must protect yourself. Your life is not your own. It is bound to others, husband, children, village, custom. You carry their burdens as if they were your own. And when your knees ache, when your chest feels tight, you remind yourself, this is what women do. This is what my mother did. And her mother, and hers. Sometimes there is peace, not freedom, but a pause. The baby naps. The stew simmers. The sky is the color of linen. And for a moment, no one calls your name. You sit by the door. Your hands are still. For once, you watch the birds pecking at the cold earth. You almost remember what it felt like to dream. You hum a song your mother used to sing. The words are lost, but the melody clings to your bones. A child runs past, laughing, not yours, but close enough. And for that breath, you feel something that tastes like joy. It doesn't last. The baby cries. The pot hisses. Your name is called, but that moment, that stillness, it lives somewhere inside you. You return to your chores, to the endless rhythm of making, fixing, mending, soothing. But now there is a quiet beat in your heart that says, I saw the sky today. I remembered something soft. You once did speak of it. No one would understand. But the memory remains, a warm stone in your pocket. On a cold, cold day, you forget what you once wanted. Not all at once, but slowly, like a candle that gutters over hours, until nothing remains but a curl of smoke. There were things you loved once, colors, stories, rainstorms. But now, you do not notice the sky, only the way your knees creak when it rains. You forget how your voice sounded when it was not lowered or measured. You forget your favorite flower. You answer to mother, wife, sometimes even just a gesture, a nod in your direction. That means she will take care of it. You do. And in doing, you become a shadow of the girl you were. You don't mourn her. You don't have time. You bury her gently under routines, under tasks, under silence. And yet sometimes you wake before dawn and whisper your own name into the darkness. Just to hear it, just to make sure it still belongs to you. No one else calls you by it. Not really, not anymore, but you carry it like a hidden stone, small, but real. Proof that you lived for more than others. Once, you no longer flinch when your hands crack in winter. You do not pause when lifting the pail pulls at your spine. Pain is ordinary, so ordinary. You no longer call it pain. It is simply your body's way of saying, I remember. You prepare food without tasting it. You wash children without thinking of warmth. Each motion is a ritual, a prayer, not for thanks, but for survival. There is no applause for the woman who keeps things whole, only the quiet satisfaction that the roof did not leak, the child did not cough, the bread did not burn. Some days you wonder, what would happen if you stopped, if you sat down and refused to rise? But you don't sit, because something deeper than choice pulls you forward, not duty, not fear, but love, twisted through fatigue, braided into habit, woven through every small act. The love that says, they need me, even if they never say so, even if they never notice until something breaks, and so you do not break. You bend, you stretch, you ache, but you remain. You do not keep journals, you do not carve your name into stone, but you pass things down, a way of folding cloth that keeps it dry in the rain, a recipe for broth that makes a little seem like plenty, a lullaby that soothes a restless child. Your history lives in the curve of your daughter's hand, as she stirs a pot the same way you did. It lives in the patched cloak she will wear after you are gone. No one will write your story, but she will carry it in the tilt of her head, in the rhythm of her breath, in the way she survives without asking to be seen. One day, she will become you, and she will forget her name until one morning, she too whispers it into the dark. Not because she hopes to be remembered, but because she refuses to forget herself entirely, and so your legacy continues. Not in books, not in portraits, but in salt, in silence, in resilience. That is how you are remembered. That is how women keep the world from falling apart, even when the world forgets their hands held it together. There is a kind of dignity in being unseen and still choosing to care, not for praise, not for power, but because you know what will happen. If you don't set, you become the thread that mends, the fire that warms, the hands that hold. No statue will bear your likeness, no record will speak your name, but the world runs because of you. You do not need anyone to see you, not truly, but still, you wonder what it would feel like to be looked at, not as a servant, not as a wife, not as a vessel of labor, but as someone whole. As someone who once danced in the rain before she learned how heavy the world could be. You close your eyes at night, not for rest, but for a moment of remembering. There was a girl once. She is still here, buried deep. She is tired, but she is alive. And in the dark, she breathes your name. You smile, just a little. You still remember it after all. Morning comes again, as it always does. You rise, your joints stiff, your breath visible in the cold air. There's a child to feed, a wound to tend, a fire to coax from last night's ashes. But for one heartbeat, you pause. You stretch your arms toward a narrow shaft of sunlight, slipping through the thatch. The warmth touches your skin like a memory. You close your eyes and think not of tasks, but of the way dew sounds when it slides from leaves, of the way wind once lifted your hair when you were young, and running with no basket, no burden, no one waiting. You remember your mother's face in one of her rare soft moments, the way she tied your hair with quiet hands and whispered a song you still hum when no one's listening. And you think, maybe this is what remains. Not the pain, not the weight, but the small softness that somehow survived. A thread, unbroken, passed through generations, not in words, but in care, in quiet, in breath. You inhale slowly, open your eyes, and return to the world. But inside, something stays warm, something stays yours. Later, long after the chores are done, you sit outside the hut. Your hands rest on your lap, not holding, not making, just being. The sky is streaked with rose and ash. Evening has arrived without fuss. The way all things do now, you watch the chickens settle. You listen to the hush of the earth as it prepares to sleep. For the first time today, you are still. You wonder if you were not born here, in this life, in this body, who would you have been? A weaver in a quiet village, a healer with her own tools, a woman who chose whom to love and when to speak. But the wondering fades. It always does, because tomorrow, there will be more to do. And dreaming is a luxury, best saved for those with time. Still, before the light dies completely, you trace a line in the dirt. Your name. Your true name. The one you almost forgot. No one sees. No one must. It's enough that the earth knows, that the sky saw. That for one brief moment you said, I was here. And as darkness folds around the village, you stand, brush the dirt from your skirt, and step inside. The door creaks shut behind you. The fire flickers low, casting long shadows across the floor. Tomorrow will come, as it always does. But tonight, you have this moment. Small, quiet, yours. The medieval world greeted the birth of a daughter with disappointment so profound it was considered a cosmic joke. In the dim chambers where women labored to bring forth life, the midwife's announcement of a girl child was often met with sighs rather than celebration. Fathers would turn away. Mothers would weep not from joy, but from the knowledge that they had failed once again to provide the son that would secure their family's future and their own standing in the household. Gender disappointment was not merely a personal preference, but a societal expectation woven into the very fabric of medieval thinking. Sons meant survival. They carried the family name forward, inherited property, learned trades, and could provide for aging parents. Daughters, on the other hand, represented expense and eventual loss. They would consume resources for years only to be given away to another family through marriage, taking with them a dowry that often strained family finances to the breaking point. The moment a girl child entered the world, she was already being prepared for a life of apology. Her very existence was seen as evidence of divine displeasure or maternal inadequacy. Medical texts of the time, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman theories, suggested that female children were the result of weak seed, cold winds during conception, or the mother's insufficient heat during pregnancy. These pseudo-scientific explanations served to reinforce what society already believed, that women were inherently inferior, incomplete versions of men who had somehow failed to develop properly in the womb. Baptism became a form of cosmic insurance policy for these unwanted daughters. The church taught that all children were born stained with original sin, but for girls, this stain seemed to run deeper. The ritual of baptism was performed with particular urgency for female infants, as if their souls were in greater peril from the moment they arrived. Holy water washed away the sin of Adam and Eve, but it could not wash away the sin of being born female in a world that viewed femininity itself as a form of moral weakness. The naming of daughters often reflected their diminished status. While sons might be given the names of kings, saints, or ancestors, daughters frequently received names that emphasized their expected roles rather than their individual worth. Mary, Agnes, Marguerite, and Catherine were popular choices, but not because parents hoped their daughters would emulate these saints' strength and wisdom. Instead, these names carried expectations of piety, submission, and self-sacrifice that would follow the child throughout her life. Early loss of autonomy began before a girl could even walk or speak. While infant sons were often kept close to their mothers and given the best food and care the family could provide, daughters were frequently handed over to wet nurses or other caretakers who were paid to keep them alive with minimal investment. This early separation served multiple purposes. It freed the mother to conceive again quickly, hopefully producing a son this time. It also began the process of teaching the daughter that her needs were secondary, that love and attention were conditional commodities that she would need to earn through perfect behavior and unwavering service to others. Wet nurses, often women who had lost their own children or were desperately poor, formed complex relationships with these rejected daughters. Some became surrogate mothers, providing the warmth and affection that biological parents withheld. Others, bitter about their own circumstances, treated their charges with the same casual cruelty they had experienced themselves. The lottery of which type of wet nurse a girl received could shape her understanding of human relationships for the rest of her life. The role of wet nurses extended far beyond simple feeding. These women became the first teachers of feminine submission, the first to whisper the lessons that would echo through a girl's entire existence. Be quiet, be small, don't ask for too much. Accept what is given to you. Smile when you are hurt. These lessons were not taught through formal instruction, but through the daily rhythm of life, as natural and inevitable as the rising of the sun. Mothering, when it occurred at all, was often performative rather than genuinely nurturing. Medieval mothers, themselves products of this same system of diminishment, struggled to show warmth to daughters they knew would suffer the same fate they had endured. Love became a dangerous emotion, one that made the inevitable pain of watching a daughter's spirit slowly crushed almost unbearable. It was easier to maintain emotional distance, to prepare both mother and daughter for the separation that marriage would eventually bring. The physical care of infant daughters reflected their status as temporary residents in their birth families. While sons might receive new clothes and toys, daughters were dressed in hand-me-downs or simple garments that emphasized function over beauty. Their toys, if they had any, were miniature versions of the tools they would use in their adult lives. Tiny spindles, mock cooking pots, dolls that taught them to practice the mothering they would be expected to perform whether they wanted children or not. As these infant daughters grew into toddlers, their families began the slow process of forgetting them even while they were still present. Sons were remembered through stories, their first words celebrated, their minor achievements recorded in family memories that would be shared for generations. Daughters learned early that their existence was temporary, provisional, and ultimately forgettable. They were ghosts in their own families, visible only when they were needed to perform some task or service, invisible when comfort, attention, or resources were being distributed. The medieval world taught daughters that they were born to be forgotten, and most of them learned this lesson so well that they began to forget themselves, becoming shadows of what they might have been if they had been born into a world that welcomed their arrival with joy instead of resignation. This forgetting would follow them through every stage of their lives, shaping every relationship, every decision, every moment of their brief and often brutal existence. Before the age of 5, when most children today are just learning to tie their shoes, medieval girls were already integrated into the complex economy of survival that defined family life. Their small hands, still chubby with baby fat, were considered perfectly suited for the endless tasks that kept medieval households functioning. The notion that childhood should be a time of play and learning was not just foreign to medieval thinking. It was seen as dangerous indulgence that would ill-prepare girls for the harsh realities they would face as women. The daily routine of a girl under 10 began before dawn and ended well after sunset. She would wake in the darkness, often sharing a straw mattress with siblings or servants, her small body aching from the previous day's work. There was no gentle awakening, no time for the slow transition from sleep to consciousness that children need. Instead, she was expected to rise immediately and begin her contributions to the household's survival. Her first task was often tending the fire, a responsibility that came with life or death consequences. A dead fire meant no heat, no cooked food, no way to see in the darkness. Small hands learned to feed kindling carefully, to blow gently on dying embers, to understand the moods and needs of flame. Burns were common, small scars that marked these girls as working members of the family from their earliest years. There was no sympathy for tears over burned fingers. Pain was simply another part of life to be endured without complaint. After the fire came water, endless buckets of water that needed to be carried from wells or streams. The containers were often nearly as large as the girls carrying them, and the water was heavy, but medieval families could not survive without constant access to this precious resource. Small girls learned to carry water without spilling, to judge the fullness of containers by weight, to understand that every drop was precious and waste was a sin against the family's survival. The role of young girls in the home economy was far more complex than simple household chores. They were integral parts of production systems that generated the goods families needed to survive. Spinning was often the first skilled task a girl learned. Her small fingers deemed naturally suited to the delicate work of drawing out fibers into thread. She would sit for hours beside older women, learning not just the mechanics of spinning, but the rhythm of women's work. The way conversation flowed around shared tasks, the unspoken hierarchy that determined who spoke and who listened. These spinning sessions were universities of feminine submission, places where girls learned the social rules that would govern their entire lives. They discovered which topics were safe to discuss and which would bring swift punishment. They absorbed the subtle codes of female communication, learning to convey meaning through glances, sighs, and carefully chosen silences. Most importantly, they learned that their value was measured not by their thoughts or feelings, but by their productivity, their ability to transform raw materials into useful goods. Weaving followed spinning, and with it came new layers of complexity and responsibility. The looms used in medieval households were often large, expensive pieces of equipment that represented significant family investment. A girl who made mistakes while weaving could destroy days or weeks of work, wasting precious materials and time. The pressure to perform perfectly was enormous, and mistakes were met with harsh punishment that taught girls to fear their own fallibility. Beyond textile production, young girls participated in every aspect of food preparation and preservation. They ground grain into flour, using heavy stone querns that required strength they barely possessed. They churned butter until their small arms ached, learning that pain was simply the price of usefulness. They helped with brewing, bread baking, cheese making, and the endless preservation tasks that allowed families to survive the lean months of winter. Discipline in these work environments was swift and often brutal. A girl who dropped a valuable tool, spilled precious grain, or worked too slowly might be beaten with whatever implement was at hand. These beatings were not seen as abuse, but as necessary education, teaching girls to be careful, quick, and compliant. The physical pain was intended to be less severe than the consequences of incompetence in adult life, where mistakes could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Obedience was not just expected, but systematically cultivated through countless small surrenders of will. Girls learned to respond immediately to any command from any adult, regardless of how unreasonable or contradictory it might seem. They discovered that questioning authority, even to seek clarification, was treated as rebellion worthy of punishment. Their natural curiosity was methodically crushed, replaced with a reflexive submission that would serve them well in their future roles as wives and mothers. Shame became a teaching tool, used to shape behavior more effectively than physical punishment. Girls were taught to be ashamed of their bodies, their appetites, their desires, their very existence. They learned to walk with eyes downcast, to speak in whispers, to make themselves as small and unobtrusive as possible. This shame was not incidental to their training, but central to it, creating women who would never demand more than they were given, never question the limitations placed upon them. Learning to be invisible was perhaps the most crucial skill these young girls developed. They discovered how to work efficiently without drawing attention to themselves, how to anticipate needs before they were spoken, how to be present when needed and absent when their presence might be inconvenient. This invisibility was not just a survival strategy, but a form of psychological armor that protected them from the constant scrutiny and criticism that awaited any girl who dared to be noticed. The physical demands of this work were enormous for such small bodies. Girls developed core-used hands, stooped shoulders, and tired eyes long before they reached adolescence. Their childhoods were measured not in games and laughter, but in tasks completed, goods produced, and skills mastered. They learned to ignore their own exhaustion, hunger, and pain, focusing instead on the endless needs of others that would define their entire lives. By the time these girls reached their 10th birthday, they had been thoroughly trained in the arts of self-denial and service. Their small hands had become skilled in dozens of complex tasks, but their hearts had learned to expect nothing for themselves. They were perfectly prepared for the next stage of their development, when the chains of childhood labor would be replaced by the even heavier chains of marriage and motherhood. Marriage in medieval times was not a union of hearts, but a transaction of flesh, property, and promise. For girls who had spent their childhoods learning to make themselves useful and invisible, marriage represented the ultimate expression of their commodification. They were not brides, but bargaining chips, their bodies and futures traded between men who viewed them as investments rather than individuals. The romantic ideals that would later surround marriage were not just absent from medieval thinking. They were seen as dangerous distractions from the serious business of family alliances and economic survival. Arranged matches were the norm across all social classes, though the stakes and complexities varied depending on family wealth and status. For peasant families, a daughter's marriage was an opportunity to forge alliances with neighboring households, to secure access to land or resources, to strengthen the fragile networks of mutual support that kept communities alive during times of crisis. The girl's preferences, compatibility with her intended husband, or personal happiness were irrelevant considerations that could not be allowed to interfere with these larger strategic goals. Among the nobility, marriage arrangements were even more complex and calculating. Daughters were treated as diplomatic tools, their marriages used to cement political alliances, end territorial disputes, or gain access to trade routes. These girls often met their husbands for the first time at their wedding ceremonies, having been betrothed years earlier by parents who saw them as especially valuable assets to be carefully managed and deployed. The pressure on noble daughters to be perfect marriage material was enormous, as any flaw in their appearance, behavior, or reputation could destroy carefully laid plans and bring shame upon their entire family. The dowry system transformed daughters from family members into financial burdens whose value had to be carefully calculated and paid. Families often spent years preparing dowries for their daughters, accumulating goods, money, and property that would be transferred to the husband's family upon marriage. This system created perverse incentives where daughters were simultaneously valuable and expensive, desirable as connections to other families but costly to maintain and marry off. The contents of a dowry revealed the expectations surrounding a girl's future life. Household goods like linens, cookware, and tools for textile production made up the bulk of most dowries, emphasizing that the bride's primary value lay in her ability to manage domestic affairs. Jewelry and fine clothing were included, not for the bride's enjoyment, but as displays of her family's wealth and status. Money or property rights might be part of the dowry, but these assets typically became the legal property of the husband, leaving the wife with no independent means of support. The negotiation of dowries was a delicate dance that could take months or years to complete. Families had to balance their desire to make their daughters attractive marriage prospects against their need to preserve resources for sons and other family obligations. A dowry that was too small might doom a daughter to a poor marriage or no marriage at all, while one that was too generous could impoverish the family and leave other children without adequate provision. Brides were literally treated as trade goods, inspected and evaluated like livestock at market. Potential husbands and their families would examine a girl's physical appearance, assess her health and fertility, and investigate her family's reputation and financial status. These evaluations were conducted with clinical detachment, focusing on practical considerations rather than personal qualities. A girl's intelligence, kindness, or talents were relevant only insofar as they contributed to her value as a wife and mother. The legal framework surrounding marriage reinforced the idea that women were property to be transferred from one male owner to another. Under medieval law, a woman's legal identity was subsumed into that of her husband upon marriage. She could not own property, enter into contracts, or make legal decisions without his permission. This legal erasure was not seen as oppression, but as natural order, the way God had intended for society to function. Motherhood was not a choice, but an obligation that defined a woman's worth and determined her fate. The ability to produce children, particularly male children, was the primary measure of a wife's value. Women who failed to conceive quickly after marriage were viewed with suspicion and blame, as if their barrenness was evidence of moral or physical deficiency. The pressure to become pregnant was enormous, and women who remained childless often faced rejection, abuse, or replacement by more fertile alternatives. The physical realities of medieval pregnancy and childbirth meant that motherhood was often a death sentence. Without modern medical knowledge or sanitation, maternal mortality rates were staggering. Women knew that each pregnancy brought them closer to the grave, yet they had no choice but to continue bearing children until their bodies could no longer function. The Church taught that women's pain in childbirth was divine punishment for Eve's original sin, meaning that suffering was not just inevitable, but spiritually necessary. Women as the property of men was not just a legal concept, but a lived reality that shaped every aspect of married life. Husbands had the right to their wives' bodies, their labor, and their obedience. Physical discipline of wives was not only permitted but encouraged as a necessary tool for maintaining household order. A wife who spoke back, failed in her duties, or displayed independence could be beaten, confined, or publicly humiliated without consequence to her husband. The isolation that marriage brought was perhaps its cruelest aspect. Girls were typically married into families in distant villages or towns, separated from the support networks they had known since childhood. They found themselves surrounded by strangers who had their own ideas about how a proper wife should behave, with no allies to defend them if conflicts arose. This isolation was intentional, designed to ensure that wives would be completely dependent on their husbands' families for survival and support. The daily reality of marriage for most medieval women was one of constant labor, frequent pregnancy, and perpetual submission. They rose before dawn to begin household tasks that would continue until well after dark. They managed complex domestic economies while carrying, birthing, and nursing children in endless succession. They navigated the complex social dynamics of extended families while having no power to protect themselves from abuse or neglect. The concept of marital rape did not exist in medieval thinking. A wife's consent to sexual relations was considered unnecessary since she had already given permanent consent through the marriage ceremony. Women had no right to refuse their husband's advances, regardless of their own desires, health, or circumstances. This lack of bodily autonomy meant that married women lived in a state of constant vulnerability, their bodies subject to use and abuse at their husband's whim. For women who found themselves in abusive marriages, there was virtually no recourse. Divorce was nearly impossible to obtain and was scandalous when it occurred. The church taught that marriage was a sacrament that could not be dissolved, and society reinforced this teaching through laws and customs that trapped women in harmful relationships. A woman who left her husband could be legally compelled to return, and any children she bore belonged to the father, regardless of his fitness as a parent. The cage of marriage was constructed from law, custom, religion, and economic necessity, creating a prison that was nearly impossible to escape. Women learned to find whatever happiness they could within its confines, developing strategies for survival that allowed them to endure lives of quiet desperation. Some found solace in religion, others in the bonds they formed with other women in similar circumstances. Most simply learned to numb themselves to their own suffering, focusing on the needs of their children and the endless tasks that filled their days. The medieval understanding of the female body was a tapestry woven from ignorance, fear, and misogyny that created a prison of shame around every aspect of women's physical existence. From the first stirrings of adolescence to the final breath of old age, women's bodies were viewed as sites of contamination, temptation, and divine punishment. This toxic combination of pseudoscience and religious doctrine created a culture where women learned to hate and fear their own flesh, seeing their physical selves as enemies to be conquered rather than vessels of life to be honored. Menstrual myths and fears dominated medieval thinking about women's bodies with such intensity that menstruating women were considered dangerous to themselves and everyone around them. The monthly flow of blood was seen not as a natural biological process, but as evidence of women's inherent corruption and divine disfavor. Medical texts of the time, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman theories, claimed that menstrual blood was toxic, capable of souring wine, killing plants, dulling metal, and driving animals mad. These beliefs were not confined to ignorant peasants, but were endorsed by learned physicians and church authorities who should have known better. Women were taught that during their monthly cycles, they became walking sources of contamination. They were forbidden from entering churches, handling holy objects, or participating in religious ceremonies. They could not prepare food for others, tend to the sick, or engage in activities that required them to touch shared objects or spaces. This systematic exclusion reinforced the idea that women's bodies were fundamentally unclean and that their biological functions made them unfit for participation in normal society for significant portions of their lives. The practical implications of these beliefs were devastating for women's social and economic opportunities. Female bakers, brewers, and food preparers could lose their livelihoods if customers discovered they had worked during their menstrual periods. Women who served in noble households lived in constant fear that their monthly cycles would be discovered, leading to dismissal and disgrace. The need to hide their natural bodily functions created additional layers of stress and anxiety that compounded the physical discomfort many women already experienced. The psychological impact of these menstrual taboos was perhaps even more damaging than the practical consequences. Young girls learned to view the onset of menstruation not as a sign of maturity and fertility, but as evidence of their shameful nature. They were taught to hide their cycles, to feel embarrassed about their bodies, and to accept that they were periodically unfit for human society. This shame around menstruation extended to all aspects of female sexuality and reproductive health, creating women who could not advocate for their own medical needs or seek help for gynecological problems. Virginity obsession reached almost pathological levels in medieval society, where a woman's sexual purity was considered more valuable than her life. The intact hymen became a commodity more precious than gold, determining not just a woman's marriage prospects, but her entire social status and family honor. This obsession created a culture of surveillance and suspicion, where women's bodies were constantly monitored for signs of sexual activity, real or imagined. The methods used to verify and preserve virginity were both invasive and traumatic. Young women were subjected to physical examinations by midwives or other female authorities who claimed to be able to determine sexual experience through visual inspection. These examinations were humiliating and often inaccurate, leading to false accusations that could destroy innocent women's lives. The focus on physical proof of virginity ignored the many ways that hymens could be damaged through normal activities, creating a system where women could be condemned for circumstances entirely beyond their control. The pressure to maintain virginity until marriage created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia around all interactions between unmarried men and women. Young women learned to avoid any situation that could be interpreted as sexually compromising, even innocent friendships or working relationships. This isolation limited their opportunities for education, employment, and social development, creating women who entered marriage with little knowledge of the world beyond their immediate families. Religious indoctrination of female guilt began in early childhood and continued throughout women's lives, creating a psychological framework where women believed they were inherently sinful and deserving of punishment. The church taught that women were responsible for humanity's fall from grace, that Eve's disobedience had cursed all her daughters with moral weakness and carnal temptation. This doctrine of inherited guilt meant that women could never be truly innocent, regardless of their actual behavior or intentions. The story of Eve was used to justify every restriction placed on women's lives, every limitation on their freedoms, every denial of their basic human rights. Women were told that they needed constant male supervision because they could not be trusted to make moral decisions on their own. They were excluded from positions of authority because their judgment was considered fundamentally flawed. They were required to cover their bodies and modulate their voices because their very presence was seen as a temptation that could lead men astray. Monks and misogynistic theology created an intellectual framework that gave scholarly legitimacy to popular prejudices against women. Medieval monasteries were centers of learning where men who had rejected all contact with women spent their lives writing treatises about female nature and proper behavior. These celibate scholars, many of whom had never had a meaningful conversation with a woman, produced detailed analyses of feminine psychology and sexuality that betrayed their profound ignorance and deep-seated fear of women. The theological writings produced in monasteries described women as inherently lustful, deceptive, and spiritually inferior to men. They claimed that women's bodies were designed by God to tempt men away from spiritual pursuits, making female beauty itself a form of evil. These writings were copied and distributed throughout medieval Europe, influencing everything from legal codes to marriage customs to medical practices. The doctrine of female spiritual inferiority had practical consequences that extended far beyond abstract theology. Women were prohibited from serving as priests, reading scripture aloud in church, or participating in theological debates. They were told that their salvation depended on their obedience to male authority figures, that they could not have direct relationships with God but must approach the divine through their fathers, husbands, or confessors. The confessional became a site of particular trauma for medieval women, who were required to discuss their most intimate thoughts and experiences with male priests, who often had little understanding of female psychology or sexuality. Women were encouraged to confess not just their actions but their thoughts, desires, and dreams, creating a surveillance system that extended into the most private recesses of their minds. The penance assigned for female sins was often harsh and humiliating, reinforcing the message that women's natural impulses were inherently evil. The silence that was imposed on women about their own bodies and experiences created a culture of ignorance that had deadly consequences. Women could not discuss menstrual problems, pregnancy complications, or sexual concerns without risking moral condemnation. This silence meant that medical knowledge about women's health was severely limited, and women often suffered from treatable conditions simply because they could not seek help without admitting to shameful bodily functions. The prohibition against women speaking about their bodies extended to childbirth, where women were expected to suffer in silence as punishment for Eve's sin. Pain relief during labor was considered morally questionable, since women were supposed to experience the full consequences of their inherited guilt. This created a culture where women's physical suffering was not just accepted, but celebrated as evidence of their proper spiritual condition. The cumulative effect of these beliefs about women's bodies was the creation of a gender that learned to hate their own flesh, to see their biological functions as evidence of moral failure, and to accept physical and psychological abuse as natural consequences of their inherent sinfulness. Women internalized these messages so thoroughly that they often became the most vigorous enforcers of the very restrictions that oppressed them, perpetuating a cycle of shame and self-hatred that would echo through generations. Childbirth in medieval times was a journey into darkness from which many women never returned. The process that should have been celebrated as the miracle of life became instead a terrifying ordeal that combined ignorance, superstition, and brutality in ways that turned pregnancy into a prolonged death sentence. Women faced each pregnancy knowing that their chances of survival were determined more by luck than by any medical knowledge or care they might receive. The statistics of maternal mortality paint a picture of systematic carnage that claimed the lives of women across all social classes. Conservative estimates suggest that 1 in 20 women died in childbirth, but these numbers likely underrepresent the true scale of the tragedy. Many deaths occurred days or weeks after delivery from infections, hemorrhaging, or complications that were not officially attributed to childbirth. For women who survived multiple pregnancies, the cumulative risk meant that motherhood was essentially a form of Russian roulette, where each child brought them closer to an early grave. The physical horrors of medieval childbirth began long before labor started. Pregnant women received virtually no prenatal care, with most learning about pregnancy from folklore and whispered conversations with other women. They had no understanding of nutrition during pregnancy, no knowledge of warning signs that might indicate complications, and no access to medical professionals who understood the birthing process. Many women worked in physically demanding jobs until the moment labor began, weakening their bodies when they most needed strength. The birthing chamber itself was a place of darkness and terror, typically a small windowless room where women labored for hours or days without adequate ventilation, clean water, or proper tools. The medieval belief that fresh air was dangerous for laboring women meant that birthing rooms were often sealed tight, creating stifling environments that promoted infection and exhaustion. Candles or oil lamps provided the only light, creating dancing shadows that must have seemed ominous to women already frightened and in pain. Labor itself was viewed through a lens of religious doctrine that saw women's pain as divinely ordained punishment for Eve's original sin. This theological framework meant that pain relief was not just unavailable, but morally questionable. Women were expected to suffer in silence, to accept their agony as evidence of their proper spiritual condition. The screams that echoed from birthing chambers were seen as prayers, the cries of women paying the price for their sex's ancient transgression. The tools and techniques available to medieval midwives were primitive and often dangerous. Without understanding of sterilization, instruments were frequently contaminated, spreading infection from one patient to another. The practice of manually extracting placentas or attempting to turn breached babies often caused more harm than help, tearing delicate tissues and introducing bacteria into the birth canal. Many interventions that were intended to help actually increased the likelihood of death or permanent injury. When complications arose during labor, the options available were limited and often horrific. A baby that was stuck in the birth canal might be dismembered inside the womb to save the mother's life, a procedure performed without anesthesia or proper surgical tools. Women who suffered from prolonged labor might be subjected to violent shaking, forced to jump from heights, or given herbal concoctions that were more likely to poison than help. The desperation of these interventions reveals the helplessness that surrounded childbirth in an age without medical knowledge. Herbal healing represented one of the few areas where women had some control over their medical care, but even this was fraught with danger and controversy. Female healers, often called wise women or cunning women, possessed knowledge of plants and remedies that had been passed down through generations of women. They knew which herbs might ease labor pains, which could help stop bleeding, and which might induce abortion in desperate circumstances. This knowledge made them invaluable to their communities, but also deeply suspect to church authorities. The conflict between herbal healing and church doctrine created additional dangers for women in childbirth. The church viewed many traditional remedies with suspicion, seeing them as remnants of pagan practices that challenged Christian teachings about suffering and divine will. Women who sought help from herbalists risked being accused of witchcraft, while those who relied solely on prayer and faith often died from conditions that might have been treatable with plant medicines. The use of herbal remedies was complicated by the lack of standardization and quality control. Plants gathered at the wrong time, in the wrong conditions, or prepared incorrectly could be useless or even poisonous. The dosages used were based on guesswork and tradition rather than scientific understanding, leading to treatments that were sometimes helpful but often harmful. Women desperate to survive childbirth had to gamble with remedies that might save their lives or hasten their deaths. Superstition dominated every aspect of pregnancy and childbirth, creating a web of beliefs and practices that often interfered with practical care. Pregnant women were told to avoid certain foods, activities, and emotions that might harm their unborn children. They wore amulets, recited prayers, and performed rituals designed to ensure safe delivery. While some of these practices were harmless, others were actively dangerous, preventing women from seeking effective help or engaging in beneficial activities. The superstitious belief that pregnant women's thoughts and experiences could physically mark their unborn children created additional stress and anxiety during pregnancy. Women were told to avoid looking at disabled people, animals, or anything frightening, lest their children be born with similar characteristics. This belief system turned pregnancy into a constant state of vigilance and fear, where every experience was evaluated for its potential impact on the developing child. Birth omens and predictions added another layer of superstitious terror to the childbirth experience. The time of day, weather conditions, and astrological signs at the moment of birth were all believed to influence the child's future and the mother's survival. Women might be told that laboring during certain phases of the moon was dangerous, or that particular weather patterns foretold disaster. These beliefs created self-fulfilling prophecies, where fear and stress complicated already difficult births. Midwives occupied a unique and precarious position in medieval society, serving as the primary attendants at births, while walking a dangerous line between healer and suspected witch. These women possessed practical knowledge that was essential for their community's survival, yet their intimate involvement with the mysteries of birth and death made them objects of suspicion and fear. The very skills that made them valuable also made them vulnerable to accusations of supernatural influence. The training of midwives was informal and largely experiential, with older women passing knowledge to younger apprentices through hands-on practice. This system preserved traditional knowledge, but also perpetuated harmful practices and superstitions. Midwives learned to read the signs of labor and delivery, to assist with positioning and breathing, and to handle common complications, but they also inherited beliefs about supernatural influences and magical remedies that could interfere with practical care. The line between healer and witch was often determined by the outcomes of the births a midwife attended. A woman whose patients frequently survived might be celebrated as skilled and blessed, while one who presided over multiple deaths could quickly find herself accused of malevolent magic. This created enormous pressure on midwives to achieve impossible success rates with inadequate tools and knowledge, while facing punishment for failures that were often beyond their control. The persecution of midwives during witch trials eliminated many of the most experienced and knowledgeable birth assistants, leaving women with even less skilled care during their most vulnerable moments. The loss of these women's knowledge and experience represented a devastating blow to maternal health that would take generations to recover from. Communities that had relied on skilled midwives for centuries suddenly found themselves without experienced birth attendants, forcing women to face childbirth with even less support and expertise. The fear of being accused of witchcraft caused many midwives to abandon their practices or to work in secret, further limiting women's access to birth assistance. Those who continued practicing often modified their methods to avoid appearing too successful or too knowledgeable, sometimes withholding helpful interventions out of fear of supernatural accusations. This self-censorship among healers contributed to even higher rates of maternal and infant mortality. The wombs that carried medieval women's children were sites of constant danger where ignorance, superstition, and religious doctrine combined to create a perfect storm of suffering and death. Women faced each pregnancy, knowing that they were embarking on a journey that might end in their graves, yet they had no choice but to continue bearing children until their bodies could no longer function. The systematic lack of medical knowledge, the prohibition against pain relief, and the persecution of skilled healers created conditions where childbirth became one of the leading causes of death for women in their prime reproductive years. The endless toil that defined medieval women's lives extended far beyond the domestic sphere, encompassing every form of productive labor that kept medieval society functioning. Yet despite their essential contributions to agriculture, crafts, commerce, and industry, women's work was systematically devalued, uncredited, and underpaid. They labored from dawn until dusk in fields, workshops, kitchens, and market stalls, but their contributions were dismissed as natural extensions of their feminine nature rather than skilled labor deserving of recognition and fair compensation. Fieldwork consumed the lives of peasant women, who comprised the vast majority of the female population. They planted, weeded, harvested, and processed crops alongside their male counterparts, yet their agricultural labor was considered supplementary rather than essential. During planting season, women scattered seeds with practiced precision, their hands moving in rhythms perfected over generations of cultivation. Their knowledge of soil conditions, weather patterns, and crop rotation was often superior to that of men, yet their insights were rarely sought or acknowledged in agricultural decisions. The harvest season revealed the full extent of women's agricultural contributions. They worked in the fields from first light until darkness made further labor impossible, their backs bent over grain stalks, their hands moving with mechanical efficiency to gather the crops that would sustain their families through winter. The physical demands of harvest work were enormous, requiring strength, endurance, and skill that women had developed through years of labor, yet their efforts were treated as natural obligations rather than valuable contributions to family survival. Processing agricultural products required specialized knowledge and techniques that were typically the domain of women. They transformed raw grain into flour, grapes into wine, milk into cheese, and flax into linen through complex processes that required years to master. These transformation skills were essential for converting raw materials into usable goods, yet they were dismissed as simple domestic tasks rather than sophisticated industrial processes that required genuine expertise. Weaving represented one of the most technically demanding crafts of the medieval period, requiring mathematical precision, artistic vision, and mechanical skill. Women spent years learning to operate complex looms, to calculate thread counts and pattern repeats, to judge the quality of materials and adjust their techniques accordingly. The textiles they produced were often works of art that required months to complete, yet their labor was valued primarily for its utility rather than its artistry. The guild system that dominated medieval crafts and commerce systematically excluded women from official recognition and protection. While women performed much of the actual labor in textile production, metalworking, food preparation, and other trades, they were prohibited from joining the professional organizations that controlled these industries. This exclusion meant that women could not set prices for their work, could not benefit from guild protections, and could not officially train apprentices or establish their own businesses. Guild exclusion forced women to work in shadow economies where their contributions were invisible to official record keeping but essential to actual production. They operated as unofficial apprentices, working alongside male guild members while receiving lower wages and no formal recognition. They established informal networks of female craft workers who shared knowledge and resources while remaining excluded from the official structures that governed their trades. The stolen credit that characterized women's work relationships was perhaps most evident in textile production, where women might spend months creating elaborate fabrics that were then sold under their husbands' or masters' names. The artistic vision, technical skill, and labor that went into these creations were attributed to male supervisors who might have contributed nothing more than the initial materials. This systematic theft of credit meant that women's innovations and artistry were lost to history, attributed to men who claimed ownership of their wives' and employees' work. Even in trades that were nominally open to women, such as brewing and baking, female practitioners faced constant challenges to their authority and expertise. A woman who had inherited a brewing business from her father might find her knowledge questioned by male customers who assumed that her success was due to masculine guidance rather than her own skill. Female bakers were subject to more rigorous inspections than their male counterparts, as if their gender made them inherently less trustworthy in matters of quality and measurement. Noble women's isolated labors created a different but equally restrictive form of unpaid work. These women were responsible for managing complex household economies that might include dozens of servants, multiple properties, and extensive agricultural operations. They oversaw food production and preservation, textile manufacturing, medical care, and education for large extended families and dependent communities. Yet this management work was dismissed as natural feminine duty rather than skilled administration, deserving of recognition. The estate management responsibilities of noble women required sophisticated understanding of agriculture, finance, law, and diplomacy. They negotiated contracts with suppliers, managed seasonal labor forces, resolved disputes between tenants, and maintained detailed records of income and expenses. During their husbands' absences for military campaigns or court duties, they often served as the sole administrators of vast estates, making decisions that affected hundreds of people's livelihoods. The diplomatic work performed by noble women was particularly undervalued, despite its crucial importance to family survival and advancement. They negotiated marriage alliances, maintained correspondence with influential families, hosted important guests, and gathered intelligence about political developments. Their social skills and emotional intelligence were essential tools for advancing family interests, yet these contributions were treated as entertainment rather than serious political work. The medical labor performed by women across all social classes represented another form of unrecognized expertise. They served as the primary healthcare providers for their families and communities, diagnosing illnesses, preparing remedies, and caring for the sick and injured. Their knowledge of herbal medicine, anatomical treatment, and disease management was often superior to that of formally trained physicians, yet their healing work was dismissed as instinctive caregiving rather than skilled medical practice. Women's roles as educators and knowledge keepers were similarly unrecognized, despite their fundamental importance to cultural transmission. They taught children to read and write, passed down cultural traditions and folklore, and preserved family histories through oral traditions. Their educational work laid the foundation for all formal learning, yet they were excluded from official teaching positions and scholarly recognition. Emotional labor represented perhaps the most invisible and unvalued form of work that women performed. They were expected to manage the emotional climate of their households, providing comfort and support to family members while suppressing their own needs and feelings. This emotional management required sophisticated psychological skills and constant vigilance, yet it was treated as natural feminine instinct rather than acquired expertise, deserving of recognition. The unspoken sacrifice that characterized women's labor extended beyond the specific tasks they performed to encompass the opportunities they forfeited by dedicating their lives to others' needs. Talented women who might have excelled as artists, scholars, or entrepreneurs instead spent their lives in service to families that rarely acknowledged their contributions. The potential innovations, discoveries, and creations that were lost due to women's systematic exclusion from valued roles represented an incalculable waste of human capability. The seasonal rhythms of women's work created cycles of intensity that demanded superhuman endurance and flexibility. During harvest season, they worked in fields all day and processed crops late into the night. During birthing season for livestock, they provided round-the-clock care for animals while maintaining their other responsibilities. During times of illness or crisis, they served as nurses and administrators while their own health and needs were ignored. The multitasking demands placed on women required them to develop remarkable efficiency and organizational skills. They might simultaneously tend cooking fires, supervise children, spin thread, and plan meals while remaining alert to the needs of others and ready to abandon their own tasks at a moment's notice. This constant juggling of responsibilities required mental agility and physical stamina that was rarely acknowledged or appreciated. The isolation that often accompanied women's work created additional psychological burdens that compounded the physical demands of their labor. Women working in textile production might spend hours alone with repetitive tasks, their minds occupied with worries about family finances and health problems they could not address. This isolation prevented them from developing the professional relationships and mentoring opportunities that might have advanced their skills and status. The devaluation of women's work was reinforced through wage structures that paid women significantly less than men for equivalent labor. Even when women performed identical tasks with equal skill and efficiency, they received lower compensation based on the assumption that their work was naturally less valuable. This wage discrimination created economic dependence that trapped women in exploitative relationships and prevented them from achieving financial independence. The cycle of unpaid and undervalued labor created generations of women who learned to expect nothing for their contributions, who measured their worth by others' satisfaction rather than their own achievements. They developed identities based on service and sacrifice, finding meaning in their ability to meet others' needs while denying their own desires and ambitions. This internalized devaluation of their own work made them complicit in perpetuating systems that exploited their labor while denying them recognition or fair compensation. The cumulative effect of this systematic devaluation was the creation of an economic system that depended entirely on women's unpaid and underpaid labor while denying them any power or authority within that system. Medieval society could not have functioned without women's contributions to agriculture, crafts, commerce, and caregiving, yet women were systematically excluded from the benefits and recognition that their labor generated. This exploitation created wealth and comfort for men while condemning women to lives of endless toil without praise, recognition, or adequate compensation. The moral surveillance that governed medieval women's lives created a suffocating atmosphere of constant judgment and potential punishment. Every aspect of feminine behavior, from the clothes women wore to the volume of their voices, was subject to scrutiny and regulation by a society that viewed female autonomy as a threat to natural order. This systematic policing of women's conduct was justified through religious doctrine and legal frameworks that transformed ordinary human behaviors into moral transgressions worthy of public punishment and humiliation. Laws policing women's clothing, voices, and behavior created a complex web of restrictions that made it nearly impossible for women to move through the world without violating some prohibition. Sumptuary laws dictated not only what women could wear, but how they could wear it, specifying the colors, fabrics, and styles appropriate to different social classes and marital statuses. These regulations were designed to ensure that women's appearance immediately communicated their social position and availability, reducing them to visual symbols rather than individual human beings. The regulation of women's voices was particularly insidious, as it directly attacked their ability to communicate and participate in social discourse. Women were prohibited from speaking loudly in public spaces, from engaging in heated discussions, or from expressing opinions on topics deemed inappropriate for their gender. The very act of speaking with authority or passion could result in accusations of unwomanly behavior that carried serious social and legal consequences. The concept of appropriate feminine behavior was so narrowly defined that virtually any expression of personality, preference, or independence could be construed as moral failing. Women who walked too quickly might be accused of immodesty, while those who moved too slowly could be labeled lazy. Those who smiled too freely risked being called wanton, while those who appeared serious were deemed proud or sullen. This impossible standard meant that women lived in constant fear of inadvertent transgression, their every gesture calculated to avoid offense. Witch trials and moral panic represented the most extreme manifestation of society's fear and hatred of female autonomy. The witch-hunting craze that swept through medieval and early modern Europe specifically targeted women who deviated from acceptable behavioral norms, transforming ordinary human characteristics into evidence of supernatural evil. Women who were too knowledgeable about herbal medicine, too successful in business, too outspoken in their opinions, or too independent in their personal lives became vulnerable to accusations that could result in torture and execution. The process of identifying witches relied heavily on characteristics that were simply expressions of female intelligence, skill, or nonconformity. Women who possessed medical knowledge were suspect because healing abilities might indicate supernatural power. Those who lived alone or refused marriage were viewed with suspicion because their independence challenged social expectations. Even women who were too beautiful or too ugly, too young or too old, too wealthy or too poor could find themselves accused of witchcraft if they attracted the wrong kind of attention. The torture used to extract confessions from accused witches revealed the deep sadism that underlay society's treatment of non-conforming women. The techniques employed were specifically designed to maximize pain and humiliation while providing the torturers with sexual gratification disguised as moral righteousness. Women were stripped naked, searched for devil's marks, and subjected to painful examinations of their most intimate body parts. The violence inflicted on accused witches served as a warning to all women about the consequences of stepping outside prescribed behavioral boundaries. The economic motivations behind many witch trials exposed the materialistic concerns that often drove moral persecution. Women who owned property, operated successful businesses, or possessed valuable skills were frequent targets of accusations that allowed their assets to be confiscated by accusers or court officials. The legal system that governed witch trials was structured to ensure that accused women would lose their property regardless of whether they confessed or maintained their innocence, creating financial incentives for false accusations. Punishment tools like ducking stools and scold's bridles were specifically designed to humiliate and torture women whose behavior violated social expectations. The ducking stool was used to punish women accused of being scolds, gossips, or troublemakers by repeatedly plunging them into cold water while crowds gathered to watch and jeer. This punishment was not only physically dangerous, but deliberately humiliating, designed to break women's spirits and discourage others from similar behavior. The scold's bridle was a particularly cruel device that prevented women from speaking while causing them significant physical pain. This iron contraption was fitted over a woman's head with a metal bit that pressed down on her tongue, making speech impossible while causing injury to her mouth. Women forced to wear scold's bridles were often paraded through town as objects of ridicule, their suffering turned into public entertainment that reinforced lessons about feminine submission. Other punishment devices included the branks, pillories, and various forms of public restraint that were used almost exclusively on women. These tools were designed not just to inflict pain, but to maximize shame and social degradation. Women subjected to these punishments became cautionary tales, living examples of what happened to those who failed to maintain proper feminine behavior. The concept of gossip as crime revealed the extent to which women's natural social behaviors were criminalized and pathologized. Women who engaged in normal conversation about community events, shared information about neighbors' activities, or discussed their own experiences could be accused of spreading malicious gossip worthy of legal punishment. This criminalization of feminine communication served to isolate women from each other and prevent them from forming supportive networks that might challenge male authority. The definition of gossip was deliberately broad and subjective, allowing authorities to punish women for virtually any form of speech that seemed inappropriate to male observers. Women who warned others about dangerous men, shared information about herbal remedies, or discussed their experiences with pregnancy and childbirth could all be accused of gossiping if their conversations threatened established power structures or challenged accepted beliefs. The punishment of gossip was often disproportionately severe, with women facing public humiliation, physical torture, and social ostracism for engaging in conversations that would have been considered unremarkable if conducted by men. This double standard revealed that the real crime was not the content of women's speech, but their audacity in speaking at all without male permission or supervision. The social surveillance system that monitored women's behavior relied heavily on other women who had been conditioned to police their neighbors' conduct. Women who failed to report inappropriate behavior by other women could themselves face punishment, creating a system of mutual surveillance that prevented female solidarity and cooperation. This enforced betrayal of other women was one of the cruelest aspects of the moral regulation system, as it transformed potential allies into enemies and informants. The internalization of moral surveillance meant that many women became their own harshest critics, constantly monitoring their own behavior for signs of transgression and punishing themselves for thoughts and desires that violated social expectations. This self-surveillance was perhaps more effective than external monitoring because it operated continuously and required no outside enforcement. Women learned to suppress their own personalities, desires, and opinions before they could be expressed and punished. The religious justifications for moral surveillance transformed ordinary social control into divine commandment, making resistance to behavioral restrictions equivalent to rebellion against God. Women were taught that their submission to moral regulation was not just socially necessary, but spiritually required, that their eternal salvation depended on their willingness to accept earthly restrictions on their freedom and autonomy. The cumulative effect of this intensive moral surveillance was the creation of a gender that lived in constant fear of judgment and punishment, whose every action was calculated to avoid offense rather than express authentic personality or desire. Women learned to make themselves smaller, quieter, and less noticeable in order to survive in a world that treated feminine visibility as a form of provocation worthy of brutal punishment. This systematic crushing of female spirit and autonomy represented one of the most successful forms of social control ever devised, creating generations of women who had learned to collaborate in their own oppression. The idealized vision of the perfect medieval wife was a carefully constructed fiction that served to justify women's oppression while making their suffering appear voluntary and even virtuous. This mythological figure, promoted through religious sermons, conduct manuals, and popular literature, created impossible standards that no real woman could achieve, while simultaneously blaming women for their inevitable failures to live up to these impossible expectations. The good wife became a weapon of psychological warfare that turned women against themselves and each other in pursuit of an ideal that was designed to be unattainable. Idealized roles in sermons and manuals painted a picture of feminine perfection that combined contradictory virtues in ways that revealed the fantasy nature of these expectations. The ideal wife was supposed to be simultaneously strong enough to perform endless physical labor and delicate enough to require male protection. She was expected to be intelligent enough to manage complex household affairs while remaining intellectually inferior to her husband. She needed to be attractive enough to satisfy her spouse while remaining modest enough to avoid tempting other men. Religious authorities promoted these impossible standards through sermons that presented wifely perfection as a spiritual calling rather than a practical impossibility. Priests described the ideal wife as a creature of perfect submission who found joy in self-sacrifice, who never experienced anger, resentment, or desire for anything beyond service to her family. This religious idealization of feminine submission transformed women's oppression into divine commandment, making resistance to exploitation equivalent to rebellion against God. Conduct manuals written by male authorities provided detailed instructions for achieving wifely perfection that revealed both the author's ignorance of women's actual experiences and their determination to control every aspect of feminine behavior. These texts specified how women should walk, talk, dress, eat, and even think, creating comprehensive guides for self-erasure disguised as moral instruction. The manuals assumed that women's natural inclinations were inherently evil and that only constant vigilance and self-discipline could transform them into acceptable wives. The economic impossibility of the good wife ideal was rarely acknowledged in these prescriptive texts. Women were expected to maintain spotless homes, prepare elaborate meals, produce household goods, and care for large families, while having no control over the resources necessary to accomplish these tasks. They were held responsible for outcomes that depended on factors entirely beyond their control, such as their husband's earning capacity, weather conditions that affected food supplies, or epidemic diseases that struck their families. The Wife of Bath versus Expected Obedience represented one of the few literary acknowledgments of the gap between idealized wifely behavior and women's actual experiences and desires. Chaucer's creation of this complex female character, who openly discussed her sexual desires, her manipulation of husbands, and her determination to maintain some autonomy within marriage, was revolutionary precisely because it contradicted every expectation of feminine virtue. The Wife of Bath's popularity revealed that audiences recognized something authentic in her portrayal that was missing from idealized depictions of perfect wives. The contrast between the Wife of Bath's robust humanity and the ethereal perfection of conduct manual wives highlighted the unrealistic nature of feminine ideals. While the Wife of Bath expressed normal human desires for pleasure, autonomy, and recognition, the ideal wife was presented as a being who had transcended all earthly wants and needs. This comparison revealed that the good wife was not a human being at all but a fantasy creature designed to serve masculine needs while requiring nothing for herself. The literary tension between realistic female characters and idealized feminine virtue continued throughout medieval literature, with authors struggling to create female characters who were both believable and morally acceptable. Most resolved this tension by punishing realistic female characters for their humanity while rewarding those who conform to impossible standards, reinforcing the message that women's natural inclinations were inherently sinful and dangerous. Saints versus sinners represented the only two categories available for medieval women in religious and moral thinking. There was no middle ground between perfect virtue and complete depravity, no recognition that normal human beings might possess both positive and negative qualities. This binary thinking meant that women were constantly evaluated as either paragons of virtue or agents of evil, with no acknowledgement of the complex moral reality that characterizes actual human experience. The saints held up as feminine ideals were typically women who had achieved perfection through extreme self-denial, often including voluntary suffering, sexual abstinence, and complete submission to male religious authority. These saintly women served as impossible role models, whose lives of extraordinary sacrifice were presented as attainable goals for ordinary wives and mothers. The gap between saintly perfection and normal human limitation created constant feelings of inadequacy and spiritual failure among women who could not achieve such extremes of self-negation. The sinners in medieval moral thinking were often women whose crimes consisted of normal human behaviors, such as expressing anger, seeking pleasure, or prioritizing their own needs. Women who failed to achieve saintly perfection were lumped together with genuinely harmful individuals, creating a moral framework that treated ordinary human failings as evidence of fundamental corruption. This all-or-nothing approach to feminine morality ensured that most women would be classified as sinners regardless of their actual behavior or intentions. The impossibility of occupying middle ground between saint and sinner created psychological trauma for women who internalized these binary categories. They learned to view themselves as fundamentally flawed beings who deserved punishment for their inability to achieve impossible standards of perfection. This internalized shame and self-hatred served to reinforce their submission to oppressive systems while preventing them from developing realistic self-assessments or healthy self-regard. Expectations in widowhood and aging revealed the continuing impossible demands placed on women throughout their entire lives. Widows were expected to remain sexually pure while managing complex business affairs, to be strong enough to protect their interests while remaining appropriately feminine and submissive. They faced suspicion if they remarried too quickly or remained single too long, with both choices interpreted as evidence of moral failing rather than practical decision-making. Aging women confronted particularly cruel double binds as they lost the physical beauty that had been their primary source of value while gaining experience and wisdom that society refused to recognize. They were dismissed as worthless when they could no longer bear children or satisfy masculine sexual desires. Yet they were also feared and persecuted if they displayed too much knowledge or independence. The transition from sexual object to disposable elder often left women without any socially acceptable role or source of value. The widow's dilemma exemplified the impossible choices that characterized women's lives throughout the medieval period. A widow who remained chaste might be praised for her virtue, but criticized for her economic burden on her family. One who remarried might secure financial stability, but face accusations of lustfulness or betrayal of her deceased husband's memory. Those who sought to maintain independence might be accused of unnaturally masculine behavior, while those who remained dependent were viewed as parasitic burdens. The economic realities of widowhood often forced women to choose between survival and moral acceptability. Widows with young children might need to remarry quickly to provide for their families, but such marriages were viewed with suspicion and disapproval. Those who tried to support themselves through work faced guild restrictions and social hostility that made economic independence nearly impossible. The legal systems that controlled inheritance often left widows with minimal resources while holding them responsible for outcomes they could not control. The myth of the good wife served multiple functions in maintaining social control over women. It provided a justification for women's oppression by suggesting that their suffering was voluntary and virtuous. It created impossible standards that ensured women would always feel inadequate and grateful for whatever treatment they received. It prevented women from developing realistic expectations for their relationships and treatment by others. Most importantly, it turned women against themselves and each other, creating competition for an impossible ideal rather than solidarity in resistance to oppression. The psychological damage caused by the good wife myth extended far beyond individual women to affect entire cultures and societies. The systematic devaluation of women's actual experiences and needs in favor of impossible ideals created generations of people who had never seen healthy female autonomy or authentic feminine expression. This distortion of human relationships affected not only women, but the men and children who interacted with women, who had been taught to hate and suppress their own humanity. The persistence of the good wife myth throughout medieval society and beyond reveals its effectiveness as a tool of social control that required minimal external enforcement once it had been successfully internalized. Women who had absorbed these impossible standards became their own harshest critics and most effective oppressors, requiring no outside authority to maintain their submission and self-denial. The myth created its own enforcement mechanism through women's internalized shame and constant self-surveillance, making it one of the most efficient and enduring forms of social control ever devised. Beyond the visible roles of wife and mother that defined most medieval women's lives, there existed a shadow world of female experience that history has largely forgotten or deliberately obscured. These women lived on the margins of acceptable society, finding ways to exercise agency and maintain autonomy within systems designed to crush feminine independence. Their stories reveal both the creative resistance that women developed in response to oppression and the terrible price they paid for daring to live differently from prescribed feminine ideals. Nuns, anchoresses, and spiritual isolation represented one of the few socially acceptable paths for women to escape marriage and motherhood. Yet even these religious vocations came with their own forms of imprisonment and suffering. The convent offered women opportunities for education, spiritual development, and leadership that were unavailable in secular society, but it also demanded the complete renunciation of personal desires, family relationships, and individual autonomy. Women who entered religious life traded one form of servitude for another, exchanging submission to husbands for submission to male religious authorities, who controlled their daily lives with even greater precision and severity. The life of a medieval nun was structured around prayer, work, and self-denial that often exceeded the hardships faced by married women. Nuns rose before dawn for lengthy prayer services, spent their days in manual labor or copying manuscripts, and ended their days with more prayers and meditation. Their diet was deliberately inadequate, their clothing purposefully uncomfortable, and their living conditions harsh enough to serve as constant reminders of their renunciation of worldly pleasures. The physical deprivations of convent life were intended to purify the soul through suffering, but they often resulted in malnutrition, illness, and early death. The intellectual opportunities available to nuns were both liberating and constraining, offering women access to literacy and learning while strictly controlling how that knowledge could be used. Nuns learned to read and write Latin, studied religious texts, and sometimes engaged in theological discussions that would have been forbidden to secular women. However, their intellectual pursuits were confined to approved religious topics, and their writings were subject to censorship by male authorities who determined what ideas were appropriate for feminine minds. Anchoresses represented an even more extreme form of religious isolation, choosing to live as hermits enclosed in small cells attached to churches or monasteries. These women voluntarily imprisoned themselves in spaces barely large enough to lie down, spending their entire lives in contemplation and prayer while receiving food and other necessities through small windows. The life of an anchoress was one of complete social death, a deliberate erasure of individual identity in pursuit of spiritual perfection. The motivation for choosing anchoritic life reveals the desperate circumstances that drove some medieval women to such extremes. For women facing forced marriages to abusive men, the prospect of lifelong imprisonment in a cell might seem preferable to the daily violence and sexual exploitation they would otherwise endure. Others were driven to anchoritic life by mystical visions or genuine spiritual calling, finding in extreme isolation the only space where they could experience authentic connection with the divine. The writings that emerged from women's religious communities provide some of the few authentic female voices from the medieval period, yet even these texts were filtered through male supervision and editing. Female mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Marguerite Porretti created works of profound theological insight and poetic beauty, but their writings were often attributed to male collaborators or dismissed as divinely inspired rather than intellectually achieved. The systematic erasure of women's intellectual contributions meant that even in religious contexts where female learning was permitted, women's achievements were minimized or denied. Female authors hidden behind monks represents one of the most tragic forms of intellectual theft that characterized medieval literary culture. Women who possessed the education and talent to create significant works of literature, theology, or philosophy were often forced to publish their writings under male names or to collaborate with male authors who received credit for their contributions. This practice made it nearly impossible to determine the true extent of women's intellectual achievements during the medieval period. The anonymous nature of much medieval literature means that many works attributed to male authors may actually have been created by women whose contributions were deliberately obscured. The sophisticated understanding of feminine psychology and experience evident in some medieval texts suggests female authorship or collaboration. But the systematic exclusion of women from literary recognition makes definitive attribution impossible. This uncertainty surrounding authorship reflects the broader erasure of women's intellectual and creative contributions throughout medieval culture. The economic pressures that forced educated women to work anonymously or under male pseudonyms reveal the practical consequences of women's exclusion from legitimate intellectual careers. Women who possessed valuable knowledge or creative talents had no legitimate means of supporting themselves through their abilities, forcing them to either remain dependent on male relatives or find covert ways to monetize their skills. This hidden economy of female intellectual labor supported many male careers while denying women women the recognition and compensation they deserved. Peasant wisdom keepers and oral historians preserved the cultural knowledge that sustained medieval communities, yet their contributions were rarely acknowledged or recorded. These women maintained the oral traditions that transmitted practical knowledge about agriculture, medicine, childcare, and survival across generations. They were living libraries of folk wisdom, repositories of accumulated experience that was essential for community survival but was dismissed as mere superstition by educated male authorities. The knowledge preserved by peasant women encompassed sophisticated understanding of natural cycles, plant properties, animal behavior, and human psychology that was often more accurate and useful than the theoretical knowledge promoted by university-trained scholars. These women understood which plants could heal specific ailments, when to plant and harvest different crops, how to predict weather patterns, and how to manage complex social relationships within small communities. Their expertise was developed through decades of practical experience and careful observation, yet it was systematically devalued because it was not derived from approved academic sources. The oral transmission of women's knowledge created rich traditions of storytelling, song, and folklore that served multiple functions within medieval communities. These traditions preserved practical information while also providing emotional support, entertainment, and moral guidance for community members. Women's stories often contain subtle critiques of social conditions and expressions of resistance to oppression that could not be voiced directly without risking punishment. Love letters, lullabies, and quiet rebellion reveal the creative ways that women found to express their authentic feelings and experiences despite social prohibition against feminine self-expression. These intimate forms of communication provided outlets for emotions and ideas that could not be shared publicly, creating secret networks of feminine solidarity and understanding. The survival of some of these personal writings provides glimpses into women's inner lives that contradict the stereotypes of passive feminine submission promoted by official culture. The love letters written by medieval women reveal complex emotional lives that were far more sophisticated than the simple romantic ideals promoted by courtly literature. These women wrote about sexual desire, intellectual companionship, emotional intimacy, and practical concerns with honesty and eloquence that contradicts assumptions about feminine intellectual capacity. Their letters demonstrate that women were capable of deep thought and articulate expression when they had opportunities to develop these abilities. Lullabies and other forms of women's music preserved alternative versions of history and social commentary that were transmitted through seemingly innocent domestic activities. Women sang about their experiences of marriage, childbirth, and daily life in ways that revealed the gap between official ideologies and lived reality. These songs provided emotional release for singers while transmitting coded messages about survival and resistance to other women and children. The quiet rebellion that characterized women's resistance to oppression took forms that were subtle enough to avoid punishment while still asserting some degree of autonomy and self-determination. Women developed sophisticated strategies for protecting themselves and their children, for maintaining some control over their own lives, and for supporting other women facing similar challenges. This underground network of feminine solidarity was largely invisible to male authorities, but was essential for women's psychological and sometimes physical survival. The forms of resistance available to medieval women required creativity and courage that has been largely unrecognized by historical accounts focused on dramatic political events and military conflicts. Women's resistance was necessarily covert, expressed through small acts of defiance that cumulatively challenged the systems that oppressed them. They found ways to protect each other, to preserve forbidden knowledge, to maintain some sense of self-worth despite constant devaluation, and to create spaces for authentic feminine expression within oppressive social structures. The women of the shadows lived lives that were often more dangerous and difficult than those of their more conventional sisters, but they also experienced freedoms and forms of self-expression that were unavailable to women who conformed completely to social expectations. Their willingness to risk punishment in order to maintain some degree of autonomy created alternative models of feminine existence that challenged dominant narratives about women's nature and capabilities. While their individual stories were often forgotten or suppressed, their collective example provided inspiration and hope for other women who dreamed of living more authentic and self-determined lives. The systematic erasure of medieval women's suffering from historical memory represents one of the most successful cover-ups in human history. Generations of historians, artists, and popular culture creators have collaborated, often unconsciously, to transform a period of unprecedented female oppression into a romantic fantasy of courtly love and chivalric honor. This deliberate forgetting has served multiple purposes. It has protected modern sensibilities from confronting uncomfortable truths about human cruelty. It has perpetuated myths about historical golden ages, and it has prevented us from learning crucial lessons about the mechanisms and consequences of systematic oppression. How historians minimize suffering began with the fundamental bias of historical record-keeping itself. Medieval chronicles, legal documents, and literary works were created almost exclusively by educated men who had little interest in documenting women's experiences and even less incentive to record evidence of systemic abuse and exploitation. The sources that survived to form the basis of later historical scholarship were already filtered through masculine perspectives that treated women's suffering as natural, inevitable, and ultimately unworthy of detailed examination. The academic establishment that developed around medieval studies in the 18th and 19th centuries was dominated by male scholars who brought their own cultural biases and assumptions to their interpretation of historical evidence. These historians were products of societies that still restricted women's rights and opportunities, making them unlikely to recognize or critique similar patterns in medieval culture. Their scholarship reflected contemporary beliefs about natural feminine inferiority and appropriate gender roles, leading them to interpret historical evidence in ways that justified rather than questioned women's subordinate status. The romanticization of medieval culture that emerged during the Romantic period created powerful counter-narratives to historical evidence of women's suffering. Scholars influenced by Romantic ideologies preferred to focus on exceptional cases of powerful queens or celebrated ladies, rather than examining the systematic oppression experienced by the vast majority of women. This selective attention to elite women created the impression that medieval society offered significant opportunities for feminine achievement while ignoring the brutal realities faced by ordinary women. The methodology of traditional historical scholarship contributed to the erasure of women's experiences by privileging certain types of evidence over others. Political events, military campaigns, and institutional developments were considered worthy of serious scholarly attention, while domestic life, family relationships, and women's experiences were dismissed as private matters of little historical significance. This bias in source selection and interpretation meant that the aspects of medieval life that most directly affected women were systematically excluded from historical narratives. The professionalization of historical studies created academic incentives that discouraged scholars from focusing on women's experiences or challenging established interpretations of medieval culture. Historians who wanted to advance their careers were encouraged to work on topics that were considered intellectually serious and academically respectable, categories that rarely included women's studies or social history. Those who did attempt to document women's experiences often found their work marginalized or dismissed as activist scholarship rather than objective historical inquiry. How Hollywood glamorized medieval culture through films and television programs that bore no resemblance to historical reality, but created powerful popular images that shaped public understanding of the medieval period. These entertainment productions consistently portrayed medieval women as empowered individuals who possessed agency, respect, and opportunities that were completely fictional. The visual media's need for attractive, sympathetic female characters led to the creation of medieval worlds where women could be warriors, advisors, and independent agents, despite overwhelming historical evidence to the contrary. The commercial motivations behind Hollywood's romanticization of medieval culture meant that historical accuracy was consistently sacrificed to audience preferences and marketing considerations. Producers and directors knew that audiences wanted to see strong female characters and romantic relationships, so they created medieval fantasies that satisfied these desires while completely ignoring the brutal realities of women's actual historical experiences. These fictional portrayals became so culturally dominant that they effectively replaced historical knowledge in popular consciousness. The psychological appeal of romanticized medieval narratives served important cultural functions for modern audiences who wanted to believe in historical periods when gender relationships were supposedly more romantic and chivalrous than contemporary interactions. These fantasies provided emotional comfort for people dissatisfied with modern gender dynamics, creating imaginary alternatives to current social problems. However, this comfort came